Hello again, fellow sapiens. Tonight we follow the flicker of a flame through deep time, 2 million years into the past, to meet the firekeepers of our lineage. This is the story of Homo erectus. If the first walker changed how we moved, if the first maker changed how we thought, then this one changed where we could go. This is part of human origins, a quiet unfolding of how light, endurance, and curiosity led us out of Africa and across the world. You're listening to Sleepless Homo, soft science and slow storytelling for sleepless minds. Here, we drift through time not to be entertained, but to feel the weight and wonder of what it took to become us. Now, imagine a night with no warmth, no flicker, no fire. Only the ancient stars, vast and indifferent, watching over a continent slowly being transformed. 2 million years ago, in what is now East Africa, twilight fell not just on the land, but on the creatures within it. As the last golden light retreated behind the distant ridgelines, darkness came with teeth. Lions crouched low in the thorn brush, hyenas circled the old waterholes, snakes moved silently through the grasses, cooled by the desert wind. And somewhere among this fading world, small primate bodies curled together, awake, alert, and afraid. We do not know what they saw exactly, but we know the world they were becoming. The early Pleistocene had begun to change everything. Where once there had been lush woodlands and dense forest canopies, now stood open grasslands, broken only by the silhouettes of trees grown wide to catch the sky. This drying, cooling planet was reshaping its animals, pushing them toward endurance, toward exposure, toward the plains. The shift was not instant, not apocalyptic, but over centuries, dozens, then hundreds, rain diminished, forests receded, and the creatures who thrived beneath the trees had to choose, adapt, or vanish. It's strange to think of night as an evolutionary pressure, but it was. In those vast and treeless savannas, darkness was not the romantic quiet it would later become. It was terror, no shelter, no walls, no flame, just the blackness and what moved through it. For the primates inching their way toward humanity, this was the nightly reality, an unbroken theatre of danger that lasted from dusk until dawn. Our ancestors did not yet sleep deeply. They could not afford to. Every shadow held the possibility of hunger that was not their own. And so they stayed near each other, silent, awake. Yet this fear, the profound animal panic of night, was also the crucible of something else. Because alongside the predators and the darkness came something intermittent but unforgettable: fire from the sky. The African savanna, even in its early forms, was no stranger to lightning. The wide plains, open to electrical storms, often lit up with sudden sheets of flame. Wildfires, sparked by dry season thunderclouds, could tear through entire valleys in a matter of hours. To modern eyes, they would have seemed terrifying. To early humans, they likely were, but also magnetic. You can imagine the awe, a wall of red sweeping across the horizon, tall grass crackling, animals fleeing in all directions. The fire would consume everything in its path, and then, inevitably, it would die. In its wake came scorched earth, bones, and the faint smell of something changed, charred, altered. The evidence left behind by these wildfires, burned sediments, heat-cracked stones, still lies buried in layers of East African soil. We cannot know what our ancestors thought of these phenomena, but perhaps it seeded something. Perhaps they began to understand, even dimly, that the blaze had its own rhythm. That it could harm, yes, but also clear, also reveal. There is no archaeological evidence that these early humans controlled fire at this time. No hearth rings, no clusters of burned bone in cave shelters, no tools altered by heat. And yet, these ancient grass fires were likely the first encounter our lineage had with the concept of combustion. It is easy to forget that before we learned to make fire, we had to watch it, to follow it, to fear it, yes, but also to wonder. What must it have meant to see an antelope, killed not by tooth, but by flame? To find it, still warm, its meat softened and strangely fragrant. The idea that fire might change food, that it might render flesh not just edible, but richer in energy, that knowledge did not arrive in a single moment. It came slowly, gradually, by accident. But the stage was being set here, in these twilight savannas, where primates began to step into the openness. The first sparks were falling. We also know that the bodies of these early hominins were changing. Long arms were shortening, feet were reshaping. The pelvis, spine, and neck began to align for upright travel. Bipedalism was not new, but it was becoming refined. The ability to walk long distances without tiring, to carry food or offspring over hills and plains, was now an evolutionary advantage. These beings were not yet Homo erectus, not yet the full runner, not yet the firekeeper, but they were moving, and they were seeing. The open land demanded new kinds of vision. Tree canopy no longer blocked the sky. On the plains, you could see your predators coming from far off, or at least you hoped to. Visual acuity, spatial memory, and tracking attention all mattered more now. And when fire came, briefly, catastrophically, it painted the world in high contrast. Orange and black, motion and shadow, danger and opportunity. It's possible, just possible, that in these fleeting, fearsome moments of wildfire, our ancestors began to notice patterns. Where the grass had burned, new shoots would sprout faster. Where trees had fallen, game trails opened. And where the carcasses lay, tools could find easier entry. Scavenging became more efficient. The world, briefly remade by fire, was not always worse. Still, for the most part, these primates remained spectators. They had no control. The darkness still ruled. Nights remained long, sleepless and vulnerable. And it's here, in this long period of watching and waiting, that something subtle began to shift. Not in the environment, but in behaviour. Social bonds grew tighter, not just grooming and proximity, but perhaps cooperation. One can imagine small groups forming into protective clusters at night. Perhaps they took turns staying awake. Perhaps they learned to read the alarm calls of other animals, using the night's ambient chorus to predict danger. They may have begun to dream. We do not say this with certainty. The fossil record is silent on dreams, but the evidence suggests that these early humans were already moving into new cognitive territory. Their brains were slightly larger than those of their predecessors. Their tool use, though still rudimentary, had begun to diversify. And perhaps most importantly, they were entering into new landscapes and staying. Migration is not just movement, it's memory. To return to a burnt field is to remember where it was. To revisit a riverbed at dusk is to anticipate that it will still be there tomorrow. So the world of 2 million years ago was not empty. It was dynamic, volatile, and echoing with the footsteps of the nearly human. The plains of East Africa held the bones of many species, but one of them was preparing, slowly, unconsciously, for something unprecedented. Not taller teeth or stronger claws, not thicker fur or sharper flight, but the capacity to observe, to learn, to carry forward knowledge. That's what made fire so different. You could not carry a cave with you. You could not pack a leopard's pelt unless you had already killed the leopard. But a flame, once you understood it, could be protected, nurtured, shared. And long before that moment came, the idea had to be born, that fire was not simply a force to fear, but a phenomenon to study. In that sense, this segment of the human story is not about tools or meat or even survival. It is about anticipation, a waiting place, a quiet interlude where early hominins stood at the threshold of something they could not yet name. Fire was still alien, But they were no longer entirely so. They were beginning to walk upright with purpose, to follow patterns, to watch the sky. And though the sun still set without mercy, though each night brought the same old fear, there was now something different flickering behind the eyes of the watchers. The fires on the horizon would return. And one day, not yet, not soon, but one day they would not run from them. They would stay, they would learn, they would keep it burning. If you enjoy listening like this, gently, without noise or urgency, consider subscribing or leaving a like. It helps other quiet thinkers find their way back through deep time. And if you're listening while winding down, working late, or lying awake wondering what we once were, let me know in the comments. I read them all. Timestamps are below in case you drift off mid-story. But for now, let the firelight guide you back to the first ones who carried warmth into the unknown. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the story. What if I told you the most revolutionary moment in human history wasn't when we made fire or shaped tools, but when we stood up and didn't sit back down? Imagine the slow rise of a body, longer legs, a narrower pelvis, an arching foot, and how that simple act changed everything that came after. Nearly 1,900,000 years ago in the grasslands of East Africa, a new kind of human emerged. Not a climber, not a croucher, not a watcher waiting in the brush. This one moved. Not fast, like a cheetah, but far, like a shadow at noon. For the first time in evolutionary memory, someone could walk from horizon to horizon and keep going. The fossil record calls him Homo erectus. We do not know what he called himself, or if he called himself anything at all, but we know how he was built. His bones tell the story better than words. The most famous of them belongs to a young adolescent found along the ancient banks of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. He died around 1,500,000 years ago, though his kind had been walking the savannas long before. What the skeleton shows is astonishing. A tall frame, already over 5 feet in childhood. Long femurs, narrow hips, strong knees, a rib cage shaped more like ours than any ape's, and arms finely shorter than the legs that carried them. His pelvis, spine, and skull all spoke of balance. His body was built not for bursts, but for hours, not for the trees, but for the plains. This wasn't just a matter of shape, it was a matter of strategy. The savannah didn't reward strength alone, it rewarded distance. In a land without trees for safety, those who could outlast predators and prey would win. And Homo erectus could run, not like a sprinter, but like a desert marathoner. His body kept cool by sweating, not panting. His muscles were lean and slow burning, his stride long and steady. Most crucially, his feet were arched, stiff enough to act like springs. Evolution had crafted a human ready to move not just through space, but through time. We often forget that before there were maps or wheels or roads, there were feet, and Homo erectus used them. He was the first human to make landscape itself a habitat. Not content to cling to forest patches or shaded groves, he entered the open, the wide, the wind swept. He hunted where the horizon stretched in every direction. His bones have been found in dry lake beds, river valleys, and upland plains. All places where prey roamed and the land could be read with the eyes. To thrive here, he had to be more than fast. He had to think ahead. Because out there, in the open, everything depends on timing. When will the herds cross the ridge? Where do the elephants sleep? How long does it take a carcass to cool before the hyenas arrive? This is where Homo erectus begins to show signs of something beyond anatomy. Anticipation, planning, not just reacting, but choosing. His tools begin to change, not just flakes broken from stone, but shaped, standardized hand axes, symmetrical, often teardrop-shaped, some over a foot long. These weren't just rocks, they were decisions, they were memory you could carry. But before we dwell on tools and tactics, let us return to the body, because the body carries meaning. Every inch of Homo erectus speaks of movement. He had a narrower waist than his predecessors, allowing for more efficient rotation while walking. His shoulders, still powerful, began to allow more refined throwing. His skull base shifted forward, bringing his head into balance over a spine used to long upright travel. Even his teeth changed. Smaller than those of earlier hominins, more human in proportion. Less chewing, more cutting. Something in his diet had shifted. More meat, more marrow, more pursuit. This brings us to perhaps the most overlooked part of this story. Hunger. Not abstract hunger, not symbolic, but the sharp, visceral need that drives creatures to act. Homo erectus had a bigger brain than any human before him, and brains are expensive. They cost energy. They demand fuel. For every calorie burned running across the plain, another had to be found, chewed, and absorbed. This meant meat, bones, fat. Homo erectus was not just a better walker, he was a more efficient eater. His strategies reflect it. Persistence hunting, perhaps, where prey was tracked and chased for hours until it overheated. Or scavenging with precision, arriving at a kill before the others. Either way, the result was clear. He was feeding his body and his brain, and both were evolving in sync. Still, there is humility here. We do not claim to know what he thought. The fossil record preserves shape, not stories. But from the preserved tracks and bones and tools, we can infer something remarkable. This was a creature who moved not just with muscle, but with intent, across the landscape, through the seasons, and perhaps, just perhaps, into new ideas. The first footprints of Homo erectus mark a shift from local to long range, from staying to going, from reacting to anticipating. It may seem simple, but it changed the trajectory of our entire genus. Consider what this means on an ordinary day. A sunrise, the land warming, the need to find water, food, safety. Homo erectus did not have fur to protect him from cold or claws to fight with. What he had was endurance. He could walk all morning. He could track a herd across ridgelines. He could carry a child. He could plan to return. These are small things. But over generations, they build culture. Not art or language, not yet, but behaviour that depends on memory. Roots passed down, habits of camp, knowledge of when the rains would come. This is how minds grow. Not in a flash, but in footsteps. And there is something else, something quieter. When you move across landscapes, you begin to see them differently. You notice where the wind shifts. You remember the rocks shaped like animals. You begin, even unconsciously, to build maps in your head. Cognitive maps. A sense not just of where you are, but of where things happen. Homo erectus walked into this new awareness. He didn't just react to the land. He understood its rhythm. And that, in its way, is intelligence. Of course, this species was not perfect. No evolutionary story is. Many Homo erectus individuals died young. Their lives were full of danger, lions, starvation, disease. But over time their bodies became refined for survival. And those who lived passed on traits that would shape all who followed. Every modern human carries echoes of that runner, the long legs, the flexible spine, the steady gait. We are not sprinters by birth. We are walkers, wanderers, made for hours, not seconds. This is the legacy of Homo erectus, not flame, not speech, not even thought as we know it, but movement, the ability to choose a direction and follow it until the next horizon. In this way, they became the first real humans, not just upright, but forward-facing. The world opened before them, and they walked into it, and they didn't stop. What if I told you that the first human migration wasn't planned, wasn't organised, and wasn't even understood as migration? That the earliest footsteps away from Africa were quiet, aimless and without a destination, just a slow drifting north, one valley at a time, by beings who had never seen a map, never drawn a line in the sand, and never imagined there was such a thing as leaving home. Roughly 1,800,000 years ago, something happened that had never happened before. A small group of hominins, bipedal, long-limbed, curious, walked out of the continent that had shaped them. They did not know they were crossing a boundary. There were no signs to mark the way. But when they arrived at what we now call Dmanisi, in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, they had done something no creature like them had ever done before. They had left the place of their origin and survived. The Dmanisi site, buried beneath medieval ruins in what is now the Republic of Georgia, holds some of the oldest human remains ever found outside of Africa. It changed the timeline. Before its discovery, many researchers assumed that early humans needed bigger brains, better tools, or a mastery of fire before they could spread into new environments. But the fossils at Dmanisi told a different story. Here were 5 skulls, clearly belonging to the genus Homo, with surprisingly small brains and small bodies. They lacked the robust cranial features seen in later Homo erectus fossils, and yet they thrived far from the tropics. Their tools were basic, simple flakes and cores chipped from local basalt. No complex hand axes, no evidence of advanced planning or resource storage, and yet they butchered animals, processed plants, and lived long enough to raise children and bury their dead. Some individuals lived into old age, including one who had lost nearly all his teeth and was likely cared for by others. This quiet detail, altruism, even in its simplest form, speaks volumes. These travellers were not only enduring, they were enduring together. How did they get there? No one can say exactly, but there are clues. The fossil trail suggests that hominins expanded their range gradually, not in one bold push. The geography helped. Between East Africa and the Caucasus lies a corridor of savannas, woodlands, and river systems that would have supported game, water, and edible plants. These hominins may have followed herds, tracked seasonal changes, or simply kept walking when local resources ran thin. They weren't exploring, they were surviving, and each step they took became, without knowing it, a path forward for the species. The climate of the early Pleistocene played a part too. During this period, Earth was cycling through frequent glacial and interglacial phases. Though northern latitudes were often cold and dry, warmer intervals opened up hospitable windows. The Caucasus region, nestled between the Black Sea and the Caspian, offered a mix of forest and grassland, familiar enough to sustain these newcomers, yet different enough to challenge their endurance. There were unfamiliar predators, new plant species, changing seasons, but they stayed, they adapted, they endured. The emotional weight of this moment is easy to overlook. There was no triumph, no ceremony, just the subtle scratch of foot soles on ancient soil. These were not conquerors or colonizers. They were animals pushed by hunger, pulled by curiosity, or perhaps guided by nothing more than the momentum of their own legs. But something had changed. They had crossed a threshold not marked on any map, one that existed not in space, but in behaviour. For the first time, humans were no longer tethered to one place. We had begun to drift, and drift they did. The archaeological layers at Dmanisi show repeated occupation, not a single passing event. Stone tools are found in multiple strata spread across hundreds of years. This was not a camp. It was a home, temporary, fragile, but real. A place where bodies were buried and memories, however fleeting, were laid down in the form of habit. The bones of animals, deer, rhinoceros, ostrich, show signs of cut marks, breakage, and marrow extraction. These hominins may not have been the strongest predators on the landscape, but they knew how to find what mattered. There's something else, too. The Dmanisi skulls show variation, more than expected for such a small group. One individual had a particularly elongated cranium, another a flatter face. This has led some paleoanthropologists to suggest that what we see here might not be a single clean species, but rather a transitional moment, a genetic mingling, a flux. And in a way, that's exactly what makes it so human. We are never one thing, we are always becoming. That these beings arrived in a colder, more temperate climate without fire is one of the most sobering facts. There is no evidence of hearths at Dmanisi, no burnt bone or ash layers. They would have slept in the cold, sheltered under rock overhangs or huddled in simple nests. Perhaps they used animal skins, or dug shallow pits to block the wind. We can only guess. But we know they survived long enough to matter. They left behind not stories, but skulls. Not monuments, but stone flakes. And still, they speak. What drove them? Necessity, perhaps. Scarcity in the south. Or seasonal migration that never reversed course. But it's hard not to entertain another possibility. That they kept going because they could. Because walking was now embedded not just in their limbs, but in their minds. There may have been no destination, only the promise of more. More water, more game, more open space. In walking, they had found freedom. And in that freedom, the beginnings of exploration. Today, the idea of leaving one's birthplace to find a better life is deeply human. But here, at Dmanisi, we see the earliest form of that impulse. Not romanticised, not heroic, but real. They were the first to step beyond what they had known, and to make that step count. Without knowing it, they had transformed Earth from a homeland into a horizon. And still, they left no names behind, no carvings, no maps, just a trail of bones and chipped stone, half buried in silt and time. Yet what they began would never fully stop. Their descendants would push farther, east, north, eventually west, across mountains and rivers, through forests and deserts. But the first motions, the first great exit, belongs to them. No one recorded the moment. No one knew it had begun. But in that slow crossing, something else happened. Our world got bigger, and we followed. Imagine standing beneath a sky that no one from your kind has ever seen before. The constellations are different. The stars burn in strange patterns, and even the air smells unfamiliar. The calls of night animals are new, their rhythms foreign. The ground is softer, the trees denser, and the water tastes of a different earth. Yet somehow, you belong here. This was the reality for the first humans who left Africa and survived beyond its ancient cradle. By 1,600,000 years ago, these wanderers had reached the Levant, a place of lakes, forests, and green abundance that must have felt at once alien and promising. They had stepped into a world that was not waiting for them, and still they found a way to stay. In what is now northern Israel, near the Jordan Valley, lies a site known as Ubeidiya. When it was first uncovered, archaeologists were astonished. Beneath layers of sediment, they found a vanished landscape preserved in astonishing detail, a lush habitat where elephants, hippopotamuses, and rhinoceroses once roamed, and where ancient humans left behind the unmistakable marks of their presence. They had butchered animals along the shores of a vast freshwater lake, flaked stone tools, and moved through groves of oak and acacia. This was not the arid desert that surrounds it today. It was more like an African paradise displaced northward. And there, in the midst of saber-toothed cats and crocodiles, Homo erectus, or something very close to it, was thriving. What makes this moment in time so extraordinary is not that they reached it, but that they adapted to it. Ubeidiya was nothing like the open grasslands of East Africa where their ancestors had evolved. Here, the canopy closed in, shadows shifted differently. The terrain was uneven and damp, the climate cooler. The skills that worked on the savannah, long pursuit, open tracking, would not have served as well in a wooded mosaic of forest and swamp. Yet the tools scattered across the site show no sign of failure. The stone flakes are sharp and deliberate. The cut marks on animal bones precise. Whoever lived here knew how to read the new landscape and make it work. They were not just surviving, they were learning. To live in such a place required a flexible mind. The early humans of Ubedea would have faced new prey and new dangers. Hippos, for instance, were far more aggressive than antelope. Saber-toothed cats hunted from cover, not in the open. Rivers could flood, and dense vegetation hid predators. The record shows that they responded not with panic, but with adaptation. The way they processed carcasses changed. More selective butchery, different choices in which bones to break for marrow. Their stone tools suggest experimentation with new materials, using basalt and flint from nearby outcrops. In this sense, they were becoming something new. Generalists. Creatures capable of living anywhere, as long as there was a way to eat, drink, and rest. This flexibility, this quiet genius of adjustment, may be the defining trait of Homo erectus. It is what allowed them to outlast every cousin and competitor. From tropical forests to temperate woodlands, from coastal deltas to dry interior plains, they could find a rhythm in the unfamiliar. Ubedea is one of the first clear proofs of that. Its fossil record shows animals from both Africa and Eurasia mingling. Antelopes beside deer. African elephants beside ancient camels. It was a biological crossroads. And into that crossroads came a species that carried not just tools, but memory. A growing archive of habits that could be shared, repeated, and passed down. What that means is that culture in its earliest form was already emerging. Not culture as we know it, not art or language, but the foundation of both, shared knowledge. How to make a cutting edge, where to find flint, when to move to higher ground, what to avoid. These lessons were not written, but lived. Each generation left faint traces for the next. The pattern of a campsite, the rhythm of movement between seasons, the best places to find water. It is likely that such knowledge was stored in the only medium they had, memory and imitation. If one group survived a storm because they knew which tree roots held fresh water, that lesson could ripple through generations. Slowly, survival itself became a shared inheritance. There is also something poetic in how they watch the world. When we think of Homo erectus, we often imagine endurance and toughness. But there was also curiosity. To step into new lands is to notice, to observe. The stars they saw were different from those over the African plains. The constellation shifted. The North Star was not where it had been. The air cooled more at night. The smell of the soil changed after rain. Each of these sensations would have been strange at first, but over time they became familiar, folded into the pattern of life. Under foreign skies they learned to feel at home. What these migrations tell us is that early humans were not bound by fear of the unknown. If anything, the unknown was their natural habitat. Every new landscape offered new rules to decode, and they were ready to learn them. The fossils and tools from Ubedea show that they hunted large animals, but also exploited smaller prey and plant resources. They could shift strategies depending on what the environment offered. This is what made them so successful. Evolution had not just given them legs to travel, it had given them minds to adapt. And yet, what they carried into these new lands was minimal. No shelters, no controlled fire, no weapons beyond stone flakes. Their technology was simple, but their intelligence was complex. They could improvise, they could anticipate. They could survive cold nights by huddling together or sleeping in shallow depressions out of the wind. They could read tracks and watercourses. They could scavenge efficiently, knowing when to approach a kill and when to wait. This was survival, not by strength, but by attention. If we step back for a moment and imagine them by the lakeshore, a small group cleaning a carcass as the light fades, surrounded by the sounds of hippos and frogs, it becomes clear that they were no longer just reacting to their world. They were part of it. Their tools, their habits, their movements were shaping the landscape in return. Over thousands of years, the shores of that lake became layered with bones and artifacts. the slow accumulation of presence. They were building the first faint geography of humanity, places with memory. Of course, we must be careful not to romanticize them. They did not see themselves as explorers. There was no grand plan to expand the species. They moved where food moved. They stopped where conditions allowed. And many must have perished. But what matters is that enough survived, and not by accident. By now, Homo erectus had become the most resilient creature Earth had yet produced. Their adaptability was not just physical, but mental. They could remain the same species while living in radically different worlds. That capacity to endure difference may be the most important inheritance they left us. Ubediyah stands as a testament to that. When you look at the fossils there today, it feels almost like a mirror of Africa, as if the continent itself had extended a hand northward. The bones of elephants, rhinoceroses, and giant buffaloes lie beside chipped stones made by human hands. It is the echo of migration, fossilized. It tells us that home is not always a place. Sometimes it is a pattern, a way of being in the world that can survive distance and change. Under unfamiliar stars, far from the birthplace of their species, they became something universal. The first to look up at a sky that did not belong to them and decide to stay anyway, to live beneath it, to call it home. Imagine holding a single rock and realizing it could become anything, not by accident, not by luck, but by design. About 1,700,000 years ago, somewhere in East Africa, a human hand did something that no hand had done before. It turned raw stone into intention. It was not the first tool ever made, but it was the first tool with a plan inside it, symmetrical, deliberate, and balanced like thought itself. Archaeologists call it the Herculean hand axe. To the one who made it, it was simply a way to survive. But in that chipped oval of stone lay the beginning of craft, of patience, of foresight, a tool that would last longer than any civilization that would follow. Across the dry plains of what is now Kenya and Tanzania, these first hand axes began to appear, beautiful in their simplicity, lethal in their purpose. Made from flint, quartzite, or basalt, each one was shaped by steady strikes that peeled away flakes from both sides of a stone core until a sharp, tapering edge emerged. Some were large enough to cut through the hide of an elephant. Others fit neatly in the palm, perfect for butchering or scraping. There were no handles, no bindings, no ornament, just raw stone and human geometry. What makes them extraordinary is not only their form, but their thought. To make a symmetrical hand axe, you must imagine the shape before it exists. You must see through the rock. That ability, and to visualize and plan, marks a threshold in the evolution of the human mind. Before this, tools were mostly opportunistic. Strike a rock, use the sharp edge, discard it. The Herculean changed that. These tools were standardized, intentional, and often repeated over vast distances. From East Africa to the banks of the Jordan, from the valleys of India to the plateaus of China, the same design appears again and again for over 1 million years. It was the first global technology. Wherever Homo erectus walked, the hand axe followed, a silent signature of a species that had learned not just to make things, but to remake the world. In its way, the hand axe was more than a tool. It was an idea with edges. It required learning, practice, and transmission. You did not invent one anew every time. You learned by watching. The rhythm of percussion, choosing the right stone, striking at the right angle, turning it between blows, was knowledge that had to be taught. This means something profound. By the time the Herculean tradition spread, humans were already communicating in complex ways, perhaps without words but through demonstration, imitation, and shared rhythm. The first classroom was the sound of stone against stone. To understand how revolutionary this was, we must imagine the world it belonged to. The early Pleistocene landscape was unpredictable. Shifting climates, scattered resources, dangerous prey. Meat had become an increasingly important source of energy, but scavenging from carcasses was inefficient. With hand axes, Homo erectus could butcher large animals quickly, removing muscle before scavengers arrived and cracking bones for nutrient-rich marrow. This single innovation expanded the menu of survival. It allowed humans to feed not just on what the land gave, but on what they could take. It was the first time a species turned precision into power. Some archaeologists call the Acheulean the Swiss Army knife of prehistory, but that label feels almost too modern, too clever. In truth, these were objects of stark utility. A sharpened hand axe could cut, scrape, dig, and defend. You could use one to strip bark, shape wood, or prepare hides. You could carry it for months. It was durable, repairable, and endlessly versatile. In a way, it was the first object that could truly be called personal. You might have had your own, worn smooth by your own grip, and when you left it behind, it remained as a trace, a record of presence, a stone memory of intention. One of the most striking things about Acheulean tools is their aesthetic consistency. The earliest examples from sites like Kokisle and Konso are rough, but within a few 100,000 years they become remarkably symmetrical, almost artistic. Some have edges sharpened within a millimetre of perfection. Others are shaped with elegance that seems to go beyond mere function. Why symmetry? One explanation is that it made cutting more efficient. Another is cognitive, that symmetry reflects a new kind of neural architecture, the ability to imagine balance, to find satisfaction in form. When you hold a hand axe, you're literally holding a thought, shaped in stone by a mind that could already dream of pattern. But it's not only the design that spread, it was the discipline. The Acheulean method persisted across continents and climates, outlasting glacial cycles and geological upheaval. For over 1 million years it barely changed. That stability tells us something about its makers. They had found something that worked so perfectly it did not need reinvention. This constancy is both humbling and haunting. For us, innovation is a daily ritual. For them, mastery was enough. The hand axe did not evolve because its makers did not have to. In that sense, it was the first great human success, and perhaps the first quiet lesson in sufficiency. We can see their handiwork scattered across riverbeds and ancient campsites. At Olduvai Gorge, stone flakes lie beside butchered animal bones. At Olojosaili, hundreds of hand axes are clustered near what was once a lakeshore, a place where animals came to drink and humans came to wait. Some are so similar in size and shape that they look as if they were made by a single craftsman, yet they were separated by centuries. This repetition across time suggests tradition, that knowledge could be conserved and transmitted. Each flake struck from the core was not just an act of survival, but of continuity. What did it feel like to make one? Imagine sitting under a tree, the heat pressing against your back, a suitable rock in hand. You strike once. Too deep, the edge crumbles. You turn it, try again. The second flake falls clean. The edge begins to form. The rhythm steadies. Each blow echoes through your bones. You're not just shaping a tool, you're shaping control. The moment the final taper appears, you hold something that didn't exist in nature. For the first time, intelligence has left a trace in stone. We often measure progress by change, by novelty, by how quickly the new replaces the old. But the Acheulean culture defies that. It is the longest continuous technology in human history. It endured for well over 1 million years, bridging species, continents and climates. Through droughts and ice ages, through migrations and extinctions, the design endured. Long after Homo erectus was gone, their descendants still made hand axes. The last of them were crafted by early Homo sapiens, a tradition carried forward not out of necessity, but out of inheritance, a memory of how thought first took shape. Today, when archaeologists find a hand axe, they can almost hear its maker. Each one carries the fingerprints of skill and the rhythm of blows. They are the fossils of cognition, not bones, but behaviour turned to stone. Holding one, you realise that everything that came after, architecture, art, language, science, began here, in the sound of stone against stone. The Apuleian hand axe is the first true bridge between mind and matter, between thought and survival. It was our first masterpiece, and our longest-lived one. We cannot know who first struck that perfect flake or what they felt when they saw symmetry emerge from chaos. But we can be certain of this. From that moment on, the world could be changed by an idea. The human story had found its edge. Imagine a midday horizon shimmering with heat. Every creature on the savannah hides in shade or stillness, panting in the sweltering air. But something else moves, slowly, steadily, relentlessly. It is not fast. It does not leap or sprint or strike from cover. It simply walks, then jogs, then walks again. It follows a pattern, reading the faint traces left in trampled grass and dust, following scent and sound and the subtle panic of another animal's exhaustion. It is human, or at least the first version of us that could do this. By 1,600,000 years ago, Homo erectus had become something Earth had never seen before, an endurance hunter. This was not the hunting of claws or ambush, it was the hunting of patience. In the midday heat, when lions and hyenas retreated to the shade and vultures circled high above, these tall, long-limbed humans stepped forward. They had one advantage no predator could match. They could sweat. While other mammals overheated within minutes of sustained running, Homo erectus could cool its body by evaporating heat through millions of sweat glands. Combined with long legs, elastic tendons, and a springy foot arch, this meant they could move for hours without collapse. The savannah had become a stage for endurance, and they were its first athletes. To understand why this matters, imagine chasing an antelope for half a day. You do not have claws to grab it, nor fangs to tear it apart. What you have is time. You follow its tracks, its droppings, the sound of its hooves fading over hills. Every time it stops to rest, you appear again on the horizon. You're not faster, you're steadier. And under the brutal African sun, that is enough. Eventually the animal overheats, its muscles seize, and it collapses. When you reach it, panting but alive, you hold not just meat, but victory. The first one earned through endurance, not ambush. This is persistence hunting, the art of turning biology into patience. Archaeological and isotopic evidence tells us that meat was no longer an occasional bonus in the Homo erectus diet. It was central. Cut marks on ancient bones show precision slicing, the removal of flesh before scavengers arrived. Some fossils even show marrow extraction, with bones cracked open to reach the rich fat inside. This was not random scavenging, it was systematic, and the anatomy of Homo erectus supports it. They were built for movement. Long limbs, narrow hips, large gluteal muscles, and a stable spine that kept balance during running. Their lungs and diaphragm allowed deep, controlled breathing. Even their noses were reshaped, projecting forward to humidify air during long pursuits. This was a body made for motion, for heat, for distance, for survival through stamina. The mind evolved to match. Hunting by endurance is not just physical, it is strategic. To follow prey across hours and terrain, you must remember where it fled, predict where it will seek water, and coordinate with others. The brain of Homo erectus, now averaging almost 900 cubic centimetres, was larger than that of any hominin before. This increase was not mere size, it reflected capacity for memory, spatial reasoning and cooperation. To hunt in groups required synchronization, not necessarily words, but signals, gestures, awareness of others. They could share the chase, divide the labour and converge on the prize. What might that cooperation have looked like? Perhaps one individual tracked the herd's direction, another circled to cut off escape, and others carried stone flakes ready to butcher once the kill was made. These were not plans as we know them, but patterns, rehearsed through trial, refined by imitation. Over time, the rhythm of these hunts would have forged social bonds. Hunting is a shared story, the pursuit, the struggle, the meal. Even before language, that pattern could teach. The elders showing the young where to run, how to read the wind, when to wait. The first lessons of humanity may have been taught with sweat and silence. The rewards were immense. Meat meant more calories, more fat, more protein. It fueled not just muscles, but brains. Every successful hunt fed cognition as much as the body. And with food came community. Butchery required cooperation. One cutting, one guarding, one breaking bones, one carrying the load back. The evidence of shared meals appears in the clustering of cut-marked bones, not scattered randomly, but accumulated in central places. They were not eating alone. They were feeding together. Even the injured and old could benefit. One of the most poignant fossils found at Dmanisi belonged to a toothless elder, a Homo erectus who had lived for years after losing nearly every tooth. He could not have eaten solid food on his own. Someone must have chewed or softened it for him. That act, small, tender and ancient, suggests that hunting did not only produce food, but empathy. A group that can share meat can also share care. And from that, something deeply human began to grow. The recognition that survival could be collective. The midday hunts themselves must have been grueling. The African plains at noon can reach temperatures that blister skin and dry throats within minutes. Yet this was when Homo erectus moved. Their advantage lay precisely in that cruelty. The hotter it became, the fewer animals could endure it. While other predators slept, humans became the dominant force of the daylight hours. The landscape was theirs when it was at its most hostile. It is an odd thought. Our species' earliest victories happened not because we avoided suffering, but because we endured it better. From this endurance, everything else followed. Once you can travel for hours, you can range farther. Once you can coordinate a hunt, you can plan. Once you can share a kill, you can imagine fairness. Evolution rewarded not the strongest jaw or the sharpest claw, but the ones who stayed together, who remembered the route, who kept running when others stopped. Persistence hunting was more than survival. It was the first experiment in cooperation, the first rehearsal of patience, and perhaps the first expression of hope. The tools of this time reflect that focus. Acheulean hand axes and flakes carried for miles became essential to butchering quickly before scavengers arrived. A freshly killed carcass attracted danger. Hyenas, lions, vultures. Efficiency meant survival. The hunters had to strip meat and crack bones fast, working in rhythm. The very edge of the stone became an extension of their will. The marks left on fossilized bone, precise parallel incisions, show that they were not fumbling. They knew exactly where to cut. By 1,500,000 years ago, Homo erectus had become the most accomplished large mammal hunter on Earth. Not the strongest, not the fastest, but the most enduring, the most coordinated, the most adaptable. This was a quiet revolution. There were no spears yet, no bows or traps, just endurance, sharp edges, and shared intent. With these, they spread across continents, surviving wherever heat and hunger allowed. The savannah was no longer just a stage for predators. It had become a proving ground for intelligence. And yet, for all their mastery, there is something humbling about this story. They hunted under a sun that could kill them, chased animals that often escaped, and relied on cooperation that could fail. They risked everything for a meal that might not come. But that uncertainty, that willingness to endure it, is perhaps what made them human. Persistence hunting was not just an adaptation, it was an attitude, a way of saying, we will keep going. When the heat rose, when the ground shimmered, when every other creature sought shade, they stood up and walked into the glare. They didn't yet know why. They didn't need to. The hunger was enough. And in that long, patient pursuit beneath the unforgiving sun, the rhythm of humanity began to beat. Steady, deliberate, unstoppable. Imagine the smell before the sight. That sharp, metallic scent of ozone, of air tearing itself apart in a storm. A flash splits the horizon, thunder rolls across the plains, and moments later the sky blooms with something no creature can look at for long. A streak of fire races through the tall grass, devouring it in a hiss of wind and heat. Animals scatter, birds rise like ash into the dark clouds. The storm passes, but the earth keeps burning. For Homo erectus standing at a distance, this was not just spectacle, it was revelation. It was danger, yes, but also light. Something alive, untouchable and beautiful. A living sun fallen to earth. By 1,500,000 years ago, Africa's climate had shifted once again. Rain came in pulses, then retreated into months of aridity. The savannas dried, grasses grew tall and crisp and lightning. The sculptor of the landscape struck again and again. Wildfires were part of the rhythm of the continent. Trees blackened, soil baked, herds moved on, and yet in the aftermath life returned greener, richer. To most creatures, fire was only terror. But for the first humans, it was something more complicated. Curiosity had already begun to override instinct. They watched not just with fear, but fascination. When we find the geological traces of those ancient fires, reddened clays, burned sediments, or heat-fractured stones at sites like Kubi Fora and Chesowanja, we cannot say for certain that humans were the cause, but we can say they were witnesses. We can imagine them on the periphery, approaching the smoking edges after the flames died down, scavengers drawn by the smell of charred meat, by the sight of carcasses too heavy for predators to drag away. Perhaps they learned quickly that fire left food easier to tear, that bones cracked open more readily. Maybe one among them, crouching near the embers, reached out with a stick and watched it glow. This moment, half discovery, half accident, marks one of the quiet thresholds in our story. Fire was not yet a tool, but it had become part of perception, something to observe, to study, to remember. The heat on the skin, the red afterimage burned into vision, the way it hummed even when still, all of it lodged itself in the developing human mind. Fire became a pattern, a recurring phenomenon, not mystery of the gods, but of the sky itself. They learned where to find it, and when it might return. The smell of smoke became both warning and invitation. It is likely that these encounters were frequent but brief. The early hominins could approach only after the flames had passed, when the ground was still hot and the air still carried the ghost of lightning. They must have walked carefully, testing the earth with the soles of their feet, watching the faint glow of buried embers in the ash. The sight of an entire landscape remade overnight. Animals charred, trees toppled, the grass reduced to black, must have been overwhelming. Yet in that destruction, something stirred. Opportunity. For the first time, nature was showing them transformation. Matter could change. Flesh could become food. Wood could become light. What they felt in those moments is beyond knowing, but one can imagine a strange blend of fear and attraction. Fire was dangerous, yes, but it was also mesmerizing. It moved like life, flickering, breathing, consuming. It gave warmth and light, the two things most missing from the darkness of the savannah night. We do not yet have evidence that Homo erectus captured or carried it, but the idea may have already been planted, that this force could be touched, or at least borrowed. A smouldering branch could last hours. Perhaps some learned to hold it, to guard it, to keep it from dying. The first taste of cooked meat may have come from this same curiosity. When animals died in grass fires, the flesh burned and caramelized, releasing aromas that no scavenger could ignore. To a hunter who had spent days gnawing raw sinew, the scent must have been intoxicating. Those who dared to eat it would have discovered something unexpected, that it was softer, richer, and easier to chew. They would not have known why. They only knew that fire did something to food that made it better. The first meal cooked by nature, not by man. The archaeological record is silent about emotions, but it speaks of patterns. At Kubifora, layers of sediment reddened by intense heat suggest that fire passed through the same area repeatedly. At Chesawanja, in central Kenya, burnt clay fragments show signs of temperatures higher than what the sun alone could produce. These may not be hearths, they could be remnants of ancient bushfires, but the coincidence of human presence nearby is telling. Homo erectus was there, close enough to witness, perhaps to scavenge, perhaps to learn. It is easy to underestimate what that meant. Every time they encountered fire, they were encountering something that defied every natural category. It moved but was not alive. It consumed but did not eat. It hurt but also comforted. The same flame that scared away predators could kill in an instant. It was unpredictable, uncontrollable, yet not beyond understanding. This duality, this tension between fear and use, may have been the earliest moral lesson the world ever gave. To live alongside fire required judgment. Imagine then a small group huddled near the smoking remains of a burnt plain. The wind still carries the scent of ash. A few carcasses lie scattered. Antelope, a warthog, perhaps a smaller mammal. They approach cautiously, waving hands before their faces against the heat. One individual, younger, bolder, extends a stick and watches the tip glow red, then drop away in smoke. It doesn't last, but the image stays. Somewhere in the growing mind of the species a connection forms. Fire dies unless it's fed. That realization, that something so alive could also be kept alive, was perhaps the first spark of imagination in human history. Long before they learned to strike stones together or nurse embers through the night, Homo erectus may have understood the concept of maintenance, of tending, of care. Fire taught patience, it taught respect. It showed that power came with the risk of loss. We often think of discovery as sudden, a single moment of revelation. But this was slower, like a relationship forming between species and element. Each generation learned a little more, where lightning tended to strike, which trees burned hottest, how long an ember could glow before fading. Fire became a seasonal presence, a recurring teacher. It must have changed how they viewed the sky, how they interpreted storms. Lightning was no longer random, it was potential. The first fires they saw at night would have lit up the clouds from below, turning darkness into a strange orange daylight. To creatures who had lived their entire lives in the rhythm of sun and moon, this must have felt like the world waking up from within. The night sky was no longer empty. It had a rival, and perhaps, sitting at a safe distance from a dying blaze, a group of Homo erectus found themselves doing something new, watching. Not acting, not fleeing, just watching. Hypnotized by motion, by light. The same attraction that still holds us today around campfires and screens was already forming then. Fire was the first cinema, the first teacher of stillness. It would take hundreds of thousands of years before they learned to keep it, to carry it, to feed it. But even now, in that faraway time, you can almost see the scene. A silent savanna under a bruised sky, a family of humans perched on a ridge, faces painted gold by the glow of something they did not yet understand. The storm has passed. The wind shifts. One ember still burns, faint and stubborn, against the dark, and maybe, just maybe, one of them steps closer. What if I told you that the first controlled fire on Earth wasn't lit beneath an open sky, but deep inside a cave? Picture it. The smell of charred wood in darkness, the flicker of light against stone, and a handful of early humans sitting near the warmth of something alive yet silent. 1 million years ago, somewhere in the dry hills of what is now South Africa, an ember glowed where none should have survived. And from that ember came everything that followed, not in a single spark, but in the patient art of keeping it alive. The place is called Wonderwerk Cave. It lies in the edge of the Kalahari region, a long cathedral-shaped hollow stretching back into the earth. It is quiet there now, except for wind and bats, but the soil inside holds one of the oldest secrets of humanity. Beneath layers of sediment, archaeologists uncovered traces that no wildfire could have left behind. Tiny flecks of wood ash, microscopic fragments of burned bone, and the darkened scars of heat on stone tools. All buried nearly a mile from the cave's mouth, far too deep for an outside blaze to have drifted in. Whatever burned there had been lit there, and tended. This is not speculation. When researchers examined the ash under high-powered microscopes, they found that it had burned at moderate temperatures, not the intense oxygen-rich heat of a sweeping grass fire, but the slow, sustained warmth of a hearth. Charred bones revealed repeated exposure to flame, as if placed deliberately. The Aculean tools found nearby, the same hand axes used for butchering and shaping wood, had been discoloured by smoke. Together, these traces form the first solid evidence of fire under human control. Not wild, not accidental, but watched and maintained. We do not know how Homo erectus first managed it. They likely did not yet know how to create fire at will. There were no flint sparks, no friction sticks. Instead, they may have stolen it, from lightning-scorched trees, from smouldering branches still burning after a storm, and carried it carefully, feeding it with dry grass and twigs until it could be rekindled. It was not invention, it was stewardship. Fire at this stage was still borrowed from nature, but no longer lost to it. They had become its keepers. Inside Wonderwerk, the world must have felt transformed. Imagine the sensory contrast. Outside, the wind howling through the dry hills. Inside, the quiet crackle of heat on bone. For the first time in our species' story, darkness had a boundary. The night stopped where the fire began. Shadows danced against the walls and the air shimmered with warmth. It was light they could return to, warmth they could summon when cold fell too early, comfort that did not depend on the mercy of the sun. But this moment, this first fire, was fragile. It was not yet universal. Archaeological layers show that early fire use was rare, intermittent. Centuries might pass between traces. Not every group could find or keep it. Some may have lost the secret entirely. In this early age, fire was still a privilege, a technology of chance guarded by a few and envied by many. To tend it was to hold both power and fear. It demanded vigilance. Let it die, and the cold would return. Feed it wrong, and it would consume everything. The first firekeepers were not masters of nature. They were apprentices to it. We cannot see their faces, but we can see their evidence. In that ash, preserved through time, lies more than burned wood. There are clues to behaviour. The placement of the charred material suggests central activity, not random scattering, but a deliberate hearth area. The repetition of burning across multiple layers implies reuse, generation after generation. This was not a one-time accident. Someone had returned to this spot again and again, to sit in the same glow. That continuity marks a turning point in cognition. To maintain fire means to plan for tomorrow. It requires foresight, memory, patience, qualities that would soon define what it meant to be human. The transformation that began here was subtle but irreversible. With fire, nights became longer, colder places became habitable. Food storage became possible. The brain that had evolved to track animals and shape stone now had something new to think about: maintenance, protection, rhythm. Fire had to be fed, not too much, not too little. It had to be shielded from wind, guarded from rain. The same attentiveness that had evolved for hunting and tool-making now found a new focus. In this way, fire shaped behaviour as much as humans shaped it. The emotional dimension of this moment is easy to imagine because it is still with us. The first time you light a campfire and feel its warmth push back the night, you are touching the same instinct. Wonderwerk's ancient occupants must have felt awe and relief in equal measure. For the first time they had a small, flickering promise that darkness could be held at bay. Around that glow, danger receded. Predators stayed back. Conversations, if they existed, might have stretched longer. Or perhaps there was only quiet, a shared stillness, an early version of what would one day become storytelling. Fire did more than change their nights. It changed their perception of safety. Caves, once damp refuges for shelter, became homes. The interior spaces of the world, places of silence and shadow, could now be inhabited. Light made them familiar. The same stone walls that had once been boundaries now reflected the movement of flame, creating illusions, faces, and shapes. Some archaeologists suggest that this early mastery of light and darkness may have contributed to abstract thinking, to the ability to imagine what isn't there. In the flicker of flame, the mind learned to see beyond what was real. Yet even with this breakthrough, the mastery of fire was not secure. The evidence at Wonderwerk shows sporadic use, pockets of ash here and there, but not constant burning. Fire was a guest, not a resident. Homo erectus had learned to borrow the flame but had not yet learned to command it. It was knowledge held lightly, passed in fragile memory rather than universal skill. In that sense, the first firekeepers were not inventors but guardians of something greater than themselves. They carried it through the night, shielded it from wind, and prayed it would last until morning. This delicate balance between control and chaos would define human progress for the next million years. Fire could give life, but it could just as easily take it. Its warmth could comfort, its smoke could suffocate. Every flicker demanded respect. And perhaps, in those earliest hearths, a new kind of humility was born. The understanding that power must be managed, not simply taken. Wonderwerk Cave gives us the first archaeological whisper of that relationship. When researchers sift through its ancient ash layers, they are not just finding burned wood, they are finding behaviour, cognition, even emotion. The charred bones suggest that fire was used for more than warmth, perhaps for light during butchery, or for deterring scavengers at night. Each possibility reveals a new level of ingenuity. These were humans learning to modify their world not by chance, but by choice. It is easy to romanticize this moment, but its reality was far more precarious. Each night's flame was a question mark. Would it survive until dawn? Would the wind snuff it out? Would the rains come? The first firekeepers lived in the tension between fear and mastery. Their gift was not control, but care. They were learning the rhythm of a living force that did not belong to them, a lesson we're still learning today. Somewhere, perhaps, in that South African cave, a human hand reached out to push another piece of wood into the embers. The light flared briefly, reflecting off stone walls painted in soot and smoke. For a moment the darkness pulled back, not forever, but long enough. And in that fragile glow, the species we would one day call our own began to see itself not as a victim of nature, but as its partner. They did not yet know how to spark flame from stone, but they knew how to keep it breathing, and that was enough. What if I told you the biggest revolution in human history didn't happen with tools or language or cities, but with dinner? Somewhere around 1 million years ago, the world's first cook fire burned, and in its glow, everything began to change. It wasn't invention by design, it was curiosity, hunger, and chance. But when raw food met flame, the body, the brain, and even the rhythm of daily life shifted forever. Before this, eating was a struggle. For millions of years, our ancestors tore, cracked, and chewed their way through a world of raw fibre and sinew. Every calorie was hard-won. Their jaws were powerful, their guts enormous, their teeth broad and thick. Food went in raw and came out half-digested, yielding only a fraction of its energy. The act of eating was labour, hours of chewing each day, wearing down enamel-straining jaw muscles. Then came fire, and with it food transformed. We cannot point to a single moment when the first meal was cooked on purpose. There are no preserved hearths from that early time, no carbonised remains of tubers roasted deliberately. But the evidence whispers from bones, from teeth, from anatomy itself. Around this period, Homo erectus fossils begin to show smaller molars, lighter jaws and shorter faces, signs of a species that no longer needed to crush and grind endlessly. Their guts, too, appear to have shortened, trading volume for efficiency. The calories that once went into digesting plants could now fuel a growing brain. This is the foundation of what scientists call the cooking hypothesis, most famously proposed by primatologist Richard Wrangham. That the mastery of fire and cooked food gave rise to our modern energy-hungry intelligence. Here's how it worked. Cooking doesn't create calories, it releases them. When meat is roasted or roots are heated, cell walls break down, starches gelatinize, and proteins unwind. Suddenly, the nutrients locked within become far easier to absorb. The same hunk of meat that once demanded hours of chewing could now be softened, swallowed, and digested with half the effort. The result was a dramatic increase in available energy from the same amount of food. Fire turned tough survival diets into concentrated fuel for evolution. Imagine a band of Homo erectus returning from a hunt. The carcass of a small antelope or pig lies by the smouldering hearth. Someone places a strip of flesh near the coals, perhaps by accident, perhaps on purpose. The air fills with a new smell, rich, savoury, irresistible. The taste that follows is unlike anything before, soft, warm, sweet in a way raw meat could never be. The pleasure of that discovery might have been the most ancient memory of flavour. They could not have known what chemistry was taking place, but they knew the feeling: ease, warmth, satisfaction. The body understood before the mind did. Cooking didn't just make food tastier, it made life longer. Softer diets meant fewer broken teeth, fewer jaw infections, and less energy wasted in digestion. For females, it may have allowed shorter intervals between births, more nutrition, more energy for pregnancy, faster recovery. For children, it meant earlier weaning and access to richer foods. Every advantage compounded. Evolution favours what feeds itself well, and fire-fed humans were thriving. There's also a subtler transformation buried in this story: time. Before cooking, eating was a constant occupation. Great apes spend up to 6 hours a day chewing. By contrast, a modern human can consume enough calories in a fraction of that time. The first cooked meals freed our ancestors from the endless grind of foraging and chewing. That surplus of time became something evolutionary precious. Time to rest, to heal, to think. The space between hunger and satisfaction began to widen, and in that space imagination could grow. Of course, all of this was fragile. Fire use was still sporadic. Some groups had it, others did not. Those who could tend flame had a tool that multiplied their survival chances. Those who lost it were forced back to raw diets. But when fire was present, its influence radiated beyond biology. Cooking was the first modification of nature not for defense or shelter, but for pleasure. It turned the brutal necessity of eating into ritual. The smell of roasting roots or meat became a signal, not just of nourishment, but of safety, of return. Fossil evidence supports this transition. Specimens of Homo erectus from sites such as Zhoukoudian in China and Gesher Benot Ya'aqov in Israel show gradual anatomical shifts consistent with reduced chewing force. Meanwhile, archaeological remains from places like Wonderwerk Cave suggest repeated fire exposure alongside Acheulean tools, implying that food preparation and flame were intertwined. The isotopic composition of their bones hints at a higher protein diet than their ancestors. Meat, once scavenged, was now cooked. Roots, once barely edible, became digestible. Every fire, even if short-lived, was a quiet biological experiment that rewired evolution. If you could step into one of those nights, you would see something that feels both alien and familiar. A circle of figures crouched around a faint fire, faces lit from below, their eyes following the movement of flame as they rotate a piece of meat on a stick or place roots near the embers. The smell is smoky and sweet. The air is still, save for the occasional crackle. They are not speaking as we would, but there is understanding in the rhythm of their movement. For the first time in Earth's history, life is feeding itself with light. The digestive consequences of cooking may sound mundane, but they rewrote the rules of energy. A smaller gut meant less oxygen diverted to digestion and more available for the brain. The brain, in turn, could grow larger and more complex, demanding even more calories. It became a feedback loop. Fire led to food efficiency, which led to bigger brains, which demanded more fire. The evolutionary curve bent upward, and it never stopped. There's something deeply poetic about this chain reaction. Fire began as destruction, a force that consumed the landscape. But in human hands, it became transformation. Through cooking, humans learned that destruction could create. Burning changed not just the land, but what it meant to eat, to live, to think. It was the first time we turned chaos into nourishment. Over thousands of years, those small fires must have migrated across continents. Wherever Homo erectus settled, ash and bone tell the same story. Repeated burning, repeated survival. Yet even then, this knowledge was rare, inconsistent. Some groups never learned to tend flame, surviving instead on raw diets and luck. Others perhaps carried embers for days between camps, cradling them in bark or bone, the weight of survival glowing faintly in their hands. It is tempting to picture this moment as comfort, the warmth of family around a fire, the satisfaction of cooked food. But for those early humans, it was likely still precarious. Fires died, storms came, embers went cold. Keeping one alive through wind and night required vigilance. But the reward was enormous. Fire made food safe, breaking down toxins in plants and killing parasites in meat. It turned danger into nourishment, risk into sustenance. Every bite was a small victory. When we study the fossil record, what we see in an enamel and jawbones is not just adaptation, but culture written into flesh. The shrinking of teeth, the slimming of faces, the expansion of skulls, all are echoes of those early meals. Even our social lives began to bend around this new reality. Mealtime became central, an organising rhythm that pulled groups together at predictable hours. The act of eating, once solitary and urgent, became shared and slow. And though they had no words for it, those early cooks were inventing something profoundly human. The feeling of belonging around warmth and food. Cooking was, in every sense, a quiet revolution. It gave us smaller jaws and bigger brains, lighter bones and longer lives. It created the possibility of free time, of shared meals, of thought itself. And it began, not in a spark of genius, but in the ordinary curiosity of hunger, a fire, a piece of meat, a moment of courage to taste what had never been tasted before. That first cooked bite may have lasted only a few seconds, but its consequences are still unfolding in every human life, every hot meal, every flicker of flame that touches food. The miracle wasn't that they could cook, It was that they realised they could change the world by changing dinner. Imagine a circle of light in the darkness, a glow so gentle it seems alive. Sparks rise into the night like tiny stars. The smell of wood smoke hangs in the still air, and faces, human faces, flicker into visibility for the first time. It is around this circle that something invisible begins to change. For the first time, night no longer belongs entirely to fear, and in its place, a new kind of animal emerges, one that not only survives together, but begins to be together. Around 790,000 years ago, in what is now the Hula Valley of northern Israel, a group of early humans, Homo erectus, or perhaps a close relative, gathered along the shores of an ancient lake at a site we now call Gesher Benot Ya'aqov. They didn't yet have villages, nor words as we know them, but they had something revolutionary, a hearth. Archaeologists uncovered layers of charred plant remains, burned wood, fish bones turned black with carbon, and stone tools lying beside them. It was the unmistakable signature of controlled fire. Fire used not just to cook, but to gather, to linger, to exist together after dark. The world of these humans was one of daily motion and danger. Days were spent foraging, hunting, crafting tools, carrying water, and avoiding predators. But at night, something profound happened. They stayed. Fire created time that did not exist before, time after the sun. The campfire stretched the day into the evening, giving rise to what may have been the first social space in human history. This was not the practical space of the hunt or the gathering ground of work. It was something softer, quieter, and more mysterious. For the first time, light and warmth created an island in the darkness where humans could simply be in each other's company. The archaeological evidence at Gesher Benot Ya'aqov gives us a glimpse of this transformation. The site preserves not one, but multiple hearths scattered across the ancient lakeshore sediments, suggesting repeated, organised use of fire in one place. Around them lay clusters of flint tools and animal bones, indicators of cooking, sharing, and perhaps division of labour. Fish were roasted in the shallows, plants and nuts gathered nearby were burned or processed. This was not accident or chance. It was pattern, and pattern means culture. Firelight changes how we see, but also how we see each other. Under its glow, faces appear where there was once only silhouette. Eyes catch reflections, gestures become visible, emotions readable. The flicker of flame makes movement intimate. It creates an audience. Anthropologists have suggested that the campfire was the first classroom, the first theatre, the first sanctuary. Within that circle of light, knowledge could be shared across generations. The angle of a hand axe, the rhythm of a hunt, the way to read the tracks of an antelope or the behaviour of clouds. The elders, whose bodies could no longer chase prey, now held a new kind of importance. Their memory became a survival tool passed down in flickering light. We can't know what words, if any, were spoken. Perhaps only sounds, gestures, laughter. Perhaps a rhythmic hum, the beginnings of proto-language shaped by the cadence of breath and the rise and fall of fire. The glow of flame may have encouraged mimicry, imitation, and eventually story. Humans learn by watching, and what better teacher than movement under light? When the flames danced, perhaps hands began to move with them. The first stories may have been shadows cast on stone. There's something poetic in imagining the lake's reflection at night. Fire mirrored in still water, faces mirrored beside it. Each person saw themselves and others as illuminated beings, distinct against the dark. This awareness that you and I exist together may have been deepened by this simple visual shift. Fire did not just bring warmth, it brought identity. Around the hearth, individuality and belonging were no longer opposites but intertwined. The circle of light was both boundary and invitation, a shared horizon of safety and trust. Biologically, too, the fire circle made sense. The light kept predators at bay. The heat allowed bodies to rest without constant vigilance. Sleep could deepen, digestion could recover, muscles could heal. But these physical comforts were only part of the story. Fire made safety visible, and visible safety allowed for something new: vulnerability. One could close their eyes while another stayed awake to tend the embers. In this mutual dependency lay the seed of empathy, of trust, perhaps even of love. Imagine the texture of such a night, the rhythmic crackle of wood, the faint pop of resin, the hush between distant animal calls. Someone tosses a branch into the coals, a brief flare illuminates the group. For a moment the cave or lakeshore feels infinite. Sparks rise like thoughts unspoken. The humans here have no need for words to communicate what they feel. Their bodies lean toward warmth. Their movements synchronize. This is not survival by instinct alone. It is the birth of communion. Some researchers argue that this was also the dawn of teaching as a deliberate act. A parent showing a child how to turn a fish over the coals. An elder demonstrating how to strike stone on stone. The act of sharing knowledge became structured by the rhythm of the fire itself. Slow, patient, deliberate. Fire required attention, and attention became contagious. The discipline of tending a flame mirrored the discipline of learning. In this way, the hearth became both a literal and symbolic centre of early human life, a circle that demanded care, cooperation, and foresight. It's also likely that laughter began here. Firelight invites ease, the shadows soften danger, and with warmth comes the first relaxation of the jaw, the breath that turns to sound, the spontaneous noise of amusement. Perhaps the first laughter was nervous, relief that the darkness held no predators, but once begun, it would not stop. To share warmth is to share mood. The synchrony of emotion, the recognition of shared experience, may have been as transformative as the flame itself. The sight of Gesher Benot Ya'aqov tells us that these humans were already masters of repetition. They returned to the same place, season after season, year after year. Fire made this possible. It fixed them in place, if only for a while, turning landscapes into homes, shelters into memory. To have a hearth is to have a point of return. Archaeologists find that within its ash layers lie seeds, charred nuts, fish remains, even fragments of fruit. Each represents a moment of cooperation, one person gathering, another cooking, others waiting and watching. It was no longer every individual for themselves. Fire demanded patience, and patience demanded community. Under these conditions, the mind could stretch beyond immediate need. The hypnotic rhythm of fire invites imagination. It slows the world down. The flames dance, casting shapes that aren't really there. Faces, animals, movements. Perhaps this is where wonder began. Fire taught the brain to find pattern in randomness, to see form in motion, to imagine the unseen. The flickering walls of a cave or the reflection on a lake could have been the first canvas for dreams. The human capacity for story, for vision, may have been born from staring too long at flame. When dawn finally broke, the ashes of those fires marked more than a campsite. They marked a shift in what it meant to live together. Fire had extended the day, expanded the mind, softened fear, and drawn the species into circles of trust. What began as a tool became a mirror, and in that mirror, humans saw themselves not just as individuals chasing survival, but as something shared, something continuous. We still gather this way today, around campfires, around tables, around screens. The flicker has changed, but the instinct is the same. We seek the glow, the warmth, the faces of others reflected in light. The first fellowship was not built by language or law, but by fire. It gave us more than warmth. It gave us each other. What if I told you that one of the most important chapters in our story began not in warmth, but in cold? Picture it. A small band of humans, thin-skinned, hair sparse, breath steaming in the air, walking across a frozen plain beneath a pale, enormous sky. The earth is hard, the wind cuts, and yet they move forward. For the first time our ancestors have left the cradle of constant summer. The world has grown colder, and to survive it, they will have to change not just what they do, but who they are. Around 700,000 years ago, a quiet revolution unfolded across the continents. Homo erectus, that long-lived wanderer, pushed farther north than any human before. They reached temperate regions of Eurasia, the grassy lowlands of northern China, the forested valleys of Europe, perhaps even the foothills of the Himalayas. The tropical landscapes that once shaped their evolution had given way to forests, steppes, and winters that could kill. These were not the lush savannas of East Africa, where warmth came free with the sun. This was a world of frost and seasonality, a new experiment in endurance. At the heart of this expansion was something more powerful than muscle or bone, the ability to borrow heat from the earth itself. By this time, Homo erectus had learned, at least in some places, to keep fire. The evidence is subtle, scattered like embers across prehistory, but it glows nonetheless. In Zhoukoudian Cave near Beijing, layers of ash, charred bone, and darkened sediment speak of long-term fire use between roughly 600 and 500,000 years ago. Here, deep within the limestone chambers, archaeologists uncovered blackened bones of deer, elephant, and rhinoceros, their surfaces blistered by flame. Fragments of charcoal lie among stone tools, suggesting that fire was made, maintained, and used again and again, not a lightning spark or a passing blaze, but a campfire deliberately tended. Imagine the scene. Snow drifts at the cave's mouth. Inside, a small, flickering light pushes back the cold. The smell of smoke clings to stone and skin alike. A few figures crouch close, hands outstretched, the red glow reflecting in their eyes. The sound of crackling wood replaces the howls of predators beyond. Outside, winter is lethal. Inside, life continues. For the first time, fire is no longer an accident. It is survival, harnessed. The mastery of flame was more than comfort. It was protection. Cold, after all, is a predator of its own. Without fur, early humans were ill-equipped to withstand freezing nights. But a fire changed that equation. It provided heat, light, and defense all at once. Big cats and wolves hesitated to approach a blaze. Frostbite became less of a threat. Even the simple act of sleeping near warmth transformed the night from an enemy into a companion. For the first time in evolutionary history, humans carried summer into winter. Yet the archaeological record reminds us this mastery was incomplete. Fire use during this time was widespread but not universal. Some populations seemed to thrive without it, even in marginal climates. In the colder reaches of early Europe, there are long periods with little or no sign of hearths or ash. Fossil remains from sites like Boxgrove in England or Torralba in Spain show that Homo erectus and their successors sometimes endured glacial environments without the steady companionship of flame. How? Perhaps through behavioural adaptation, wearing animal hides, seeking shelter in caves, or migrating seasonally. Fire was a gift, but not one yet guaranteed. In this way, fire in the mid-Pleistocene was still a fragile inheritance passed unevenly through generations. It may have been discovered, lost, and rediscovered countless times. A storm could extinguish it. A move to new territory might mean starting over from scratch. Some groups likely carried embers from camp to camp, keeping the precious spark alive in bark, bone, or dried dung. To lose fire was to fall back into darkness, to return to a world where every night was a test of endurance. The late phases of Homo erectus expansion tell a story not just of technology, but of adaptation itself. In moving into Eurasia's chill, our ancestors became environmental opportunists. They hunted in forests, scavenged near frozen rivers, and learned to coordinate under harsher conditions. Fire played a role in these hunts, not yet as a weapon, but as a postscript, a way to thaw, to roast, to endure. The pattern of cut-marked and burned bones at Jokudian suggests not just random burning, but meals taken by firelight. Their diets diversified to include cold-resistant plants and game that could survive the winters. Their tools evolved too. More refined hand axes and scrapers adapted for working hide and wood. Fire may have made such work possible, softening material, preserving meat, drying sinew. And yet, for all this progress, Homo erectus remained in a delicate balance. The climate was changing. The ice ages were beginning their long rhythm of advance and retreat. Each glacial pulse forced migration, extinction, or innovation. Fire was the great equalizer, but only when kept alive. The geological record suggests that consistent habitual fire use did not become universal until hundreds of thousands of years later. Until then, it was a tool learned and forgotten, remembered and relearned. In many ways, the human relationship with fire was still one of courtship, not marriage. If you were to visit Eurasia in those cold millennia, you'd see small pockets of warmth scattered across the continent. Caves glowing faintly at dusk, rising smoke from hidden valleys, brief shelters carved into frostbitten earth. Between them, vast stretches of darkness. Fire was civilization in miniature, a point of light in an otherwise indifferent landscape. Every hearth was a statement. We can live here too. There's a poignant humility in realizing how hard won that light was. For millions of years, life on Earth had feared fire. Only one species dared to hold it close, and even then, it was not mastery, but maintenance. Early humans didn't yet know how to spark flame at will. They were caretakers of chance, keepers of embers. A single careless night could undo what generations had preserved. The first heating system was not mechanical. It was biological, behavioural, communal. It depended on memory, cooperation, and vigilance. In this sense, fire was the first technology that required culture. To use it well meant passing down knowledge, where to find dry wood, how to shield it from wind, how to nurture the faintest glow back into flame. Every successful fire implied continuity between generations. Those who remembered survived. Those who forgot vanished into the cold. Jokudian's charred layers are not just archaeological debris. They are evidence of this continuity. The ashes are not randomly distributed. They occur repeatedly across multiple habitation layers, suggesting a rhythm of occupation and return. Over centuries, early humans came back to the same cave, reusing the same shelters, reigniting the same fires. Each layer is a memory, a geological echo of human persistence. By the time we reach 500,000 years ago, this rhythm had spread. Other sites across Eurasia, from France to India, show traces of burning. The glow of humanity had become a continental phenomenon, if still uneven, like stars seen through fog. The idea of warmth, of mastery over cold, had taken root in the collective mind. It's easy, in hindsight, to see this as inevitable, but nothing about it was. Fire was not guaranteed. It was not a birthright. It was a challenge met anew by every generation that chose to venture beyond the equator. The survival of our lineage through those cold millennia depended not on strength or aggression, but on memory and care, the quiet art of keeping light alive. And so, through the long winters of prehistory, Homo erectus endured, walking under pale skies, carrying embers through wind and snow, gathering at night to warm their hands and watch the flames dance. They did not yet know how to create fire from nothing, but they knew enough to guard it from extinction. In that act alone lies the first glimpse of humanity as we recognize it, not just as a species that adapts, but as one that remembers. The cold made them clever. The dark made them patient. The fire made them human. Imagine a night when darkness had no edges. The air hums with insect wings. The wind carries the scent of lions, and every sound beyond the grass could mean death. Before fire, this was how every evening fell, an absolute surrender to shadow. Our ancestors didn't conquer the night. They endured it. When the sun set, they climbed trees or huddled on high ground, hearts pounding at every rustle. The world belonged to other eyes then, the gleaming pupils of leopards, the silent steps of hyenas, the whisper of snakes moving unseen. For millions of years, fear ruled the dark. And then, one evening, someone carried a branch that burned. What happened next wasn't just a change in light, it was a change in the mind. By roughly 500,000 years ago, Homo erectus had achieved what no creature before it had done. Tamed fire enough to bring safety into the night. Across the plains of Africa, through the forests of Eurasia, and deep within limestone caves, there were now points of light in the darkness. The boundary between predator and prey, between waking and rest, shifted. The fire's glow was not just warmth and visibility, it was a declaration. The night is no longer yours. For a species that had spent its evolutionary life avoiding the dark, this must have been a psychological revolution. The fear of predators didn't vanish, but it changed shape. No longer total, it became contained, held at the edge of the firelight. Lions might still prowl nearby, their eyes catching the orange reflection, but they would stop short of the flames. Hyenas circled, but hesitated. Even snakes and insects drew back from the heat. Around those small fires, the earliest humans could finally sleep on the ground with a measure of confidence. They were no longer guests in the night. They were tenants. This change wasn't just physical. It rewired the way the human mind experienced fear. Before, fear was a constant, an ambient tension woven into every hour of darkness. After fire, fear became episodic, something that could be confronted and held at bay. The emotional relief must have been enormous. For the first time in history, safety was something you could see, something that flickered and crackled and responded to your care. The act of tending fire, feeding it twigs, protecting it from wind, became the act of maintaining safety itself. Every glowing ember was reassurance, proof that the world could be managed. This newfound security reshaped the rhythm of life. It allowed longer, deeper sleep. Anthropologists have proposed that with fire came not just warmth, but true rest, a form of sleep free from constant threat. Before fire, early hominins likely slept in brief, tense intervals, retreating to trees or caves, ready to flee at any noise. With a fire burning nearby, they could relax enough to experience something like our modern sleep cycle, including REM sleep, the phase in which dreams occur. And dreams, in turn, may have nurtured imagination, memory, and problem-solving. In a very literal way, fire might have kindled the architecture of human thought. The evolutionary biologist David Sampson and others studying sleep in primates have suggested that humans' unusually deep, efficient sleep evolved alongside the use of fire. Compared to other apes, humans sleep fewer hours but with more intense brain activity during REM. This might have begun here, in those first circles of firelight, when warmth and safety permitted stillness. The mind, freed from the need to stay alert, could wander. It could simulate danger instead of constantly facing it. It could dream. And while we cannot know what early Homo erectus dreamed of, we can imagine that the first dreams born beside a campfire were vivid. Flames themselves are hypnotic. Their motion, their unpredictability, their illusion of living movement all provoke the same fascination today that they did 500,000 years ago. In their dance, humans may have seen forms and faces animals leaping and fading, the play of shadow and story. Firelight was an artist before there were artists. It painted the walls of caves, cast moving shapes across sleeping faces, and taught the brain to see pattern in chaos. This may have been where imagination began to take its modern form, not in words, but in light and motion. Archaeological sites like Jukudian and Gesher Benot Ya'aqov suggest that by this time, humans were not only using fire for warmth or cooking, but maintaining it across nights and seasons. Some scientists believe they may have even transported embers between camps, ensuring a continuity of flame. To do so required planning, cooperation, and shared vigilance. Each person's turn by the fire mattered. Neglect could mean death by cold or predator. Fire demanded community. It was both tool and teacher. The first lesson: safety is something we must build together. Night, once an endless arena of fear, became an intimate space. The circle of light carved out a new kind of environment, half wild, half human. Within it, the body could relax, and the mind could explore. Silence gained texture. Crackling wood became background music to survival. And in that dim orange light, faces became visible in a way they never had before. Fire revealed emotion, the soft glow on cheeks, the widening of eyes, the lift of a smile. To see another's expression clearly under firelight was to recognize feeling, to empathize, to connect. Somewhere in this period, fear gave way to wonder. To stare into a flame is to watch transformation itself. Solid into liquid, wood into heat, darkness into light. The physics of change, visible and warm. Every fire was both destruction and creation, a paradox contained. Perhaps this duality resonated deeply in the human mind. They saw that the same force that terrified the savannah could now serve them, and that realization, power without omnipotence, was perhaps the first taste of control. In this way, the taming of fire was also the taming of the inner world. The instinctual panic of darkness softened into something else. Curiosity, anticipation, even introspection. The night was no longer an enemy to endure, but a landscape to inhabit. Firelight invited stillness, reflection, the first whispers of what we might call thoughtfulness. As the flames burned, time itself seemed to slow, and for the first time, humans could sit, watch, and be. But the relationship was never without tension. Fire remained unpredictable. A sudden gust could turn protector into threat. Too much neglect, and the embers would die. Too much confidence, and the forest would burn. Homo erectus learned balance, how to feed, guard, and respect the thing that had changed their world. Every generation relearned this balance anew. They were not masters of fire, but partners. And yet, despite its dangers, fire became the anchor of human life. It made the night survivable, then comfortable, and eventually meaningful. The darkness that once terrified them became the canvas for their first culture. The rhythms of tending flame, of gathering around it, of watching and learning in its glow. What is remarkable is how this ancient transformation still shapes us. Even today we surround ourselves with light when night falls. Candles, lamps, screens, all echo that primal reassurance. The dark cannot have us entirely. The comfort you feel sitting by a campfire or even beside the faint glow of a phone at night is the same comfort felt by Homo erectus 500,000 years ago. It is memory, coded in the nervous system, passed through 1,000 generations of lightkeepers. Fire didn't just keep predators away. It changed the geography of fear. It let humans descend from trees, sleep on the ground, close their eyes without the weight of constant threat. It built the first psychological wall against nature, not of stone, but of light. And inside that wall, the mind could dream freely for the first time. When we look back at this moment, 500,000 years ago, it's easy to see it as survival. but survival was only the beginning. What really began was humanity's dialogue with fear, learning not to escape it, but to contain it, understand it, even find beauty in it. The firelight was not only warmth against the cold, it was the first meditation, the first story, the first glimpse that maybe, just maybe, the universe could be both dangerous and kind. That night, long ago, the predators still prowled beyond the glow, but for the first time, they were the ones afraid. What if I told you that the oldest tradition on Earth isn't art or language or even family, or it's fire? Long before stories, before words, before anyone knew where the sun went at night, there was the circle of flame, and somehow, through every ice age, drought and extinction, it never went out. From roughly 400,000 years ago onward, the mastery of fire was no longer an accident of lightning or a secret few could lose. It became humanity's inheritance, a quiet thread of light woven through the dark fabric of prehistory. By this time, the world itself was changing faster than ever before. The Pleistocene had entered one of its most violent moods. The climate swung between scorching interglacials and deep freezes, continents heaving under advancing and retreating ice. Grasslands gave way to tundra, lakes dried to dust, and then flooded again with meltwater. Volcanoes darkened the sky. Mammoths roamed the steppes. And yet amid all this chaos, one fragile continuity remained. Wherever humans went, embers followed. The fossils of this era tell us that Homo erectus was fading, replaced gradually by new forms: Homo heidelbergensis in Africa and Europe, Homo rhodesiensis in parts of the south, and other regional variants that would one day give rise to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and our own kind. But even as faces changed and skulls reshaped, one ritual held steady. Fire use became widespread, deliberate, and consistent. Archaeologists call this the moment when fire became habitual, no longer a skill rediscovered but a cultural expectation. The evidence is striking. At hundreds of sites across Africa and Eurasia, from caves to open plains, layers of charcoal and ash appear in unmistakable patterns. Central hearths surrounded by stone tools and bones, burned sediments showing repeated use. The geometry of campfire life had arrived. In the famous caves of Qasem in Israel, for instance, archaeologists found a well-defined hearth dating to around 380,000 years ago, a circle of burnt earth where bones, stone flakes, and wood ash accumulated over centuries. It was not a single event, but a place returned to again and again, like a home. In Europe, sites such as Beech's Pit in England and Schöningen in Germany preserve similar signs: built hearths, charred wood fragments, and even evidence of heat-altered stone tools. The pattern is global. By this time, fire was no longer just used, it was expected. Imagine the rhythm of life these hearths created. Each evening, as the temperature fell and darkness stretched across the land, people gathered around a familiar glow. They cooked, they repaired tools, they watched sparks drift upward into the cold air. They may not have had words for memory or tradition, but they lived them. The act of tending a flame became a form of inheritance, a lesson every child learned by example: keep it alive. If the night swallowed your light, it could mean death. So the duty was passed down: how to find dry fuel, how to shield a fire from wind, how to save an ember until morning. In that simple act of continuity, culture itself began to take shape. The mid-Pleistocene was a time when intelligence was rising in step with endurance. These humans faced harsh winters, predation, and shifting landscapes. Fire was their equalizer. It allowed them to occupy caves in regions once uninhabitable, to roast tough roots and meats, to keep warm through months of scarcity. More importantly, it offered something intangible: stability in an unstable world. No matter how the glaciers advanced or the forest retreated, there was always a place of light. What's remarkable is how resilient this practice proved. Even as species replaced one another, fire remained constant. The evidence suggests that once the tradition took hold, it was never lost again. Unlike earlier times where some groups may have forgotten or gone without flame for generations, from this point forward every known lineage of human, from Africa to Europe to Asia, shows traces of fire use. It had crossed the threshold from discovery to necessity. This endurance wasn't guaranteed. The climate between 400 and 300,000 years ago was among the most unstable in Earth's history. Massive glaciations gripped the northern hemisphere, while Africa swung between extremes of drought and humidity. Ecosystems collapsed, populations migrated, species diverged, and yet through all of this the Ember survived. That survival tells us something profound. Fire wasn't just a technology, it was a relationship. It demanded care, attention, and collective memory. The survival of flame mirrored the survival of the species that guarded it. Picture a group travelling through an ice age steppe. The wind is brutal, the snow unrelenting. They carry a bundle wrapped in bark and hide. Inside it, a single coal, glowing faintly. Each time they stop, the ember is coaxed back to life. Dry grass, breath, a careful hand. The spark leaps and warmth returns. It is not invention that keeps them alive, but continuity. The fire they carry may have been lit weeks or even months earlier, from the ashes of a camp long abandoned. The same fire, in a sense, burning across distance and time. By around 300,000 years ago, fire had become so intertwined with daily life that it shaped even how humans built their shelters and organised their living spaces. Caves and open-air sites show central hearths, not random fires. This suggests spatial awareness, the ability to plan a home around light and heat. Some sites show repeated rebuilding of the same hearth over decades, a kind of prehistory of domestic life. Fire became architecture's first cornerstone, and with this came something else. Routine. The campfire marked time itself. Morning embers, midday rest, evening blaze, nighttime watch. It structured existence into cycles of care and renewal. Each dawn, someone stirred the ashes, checking for the faintest glow. If one remained, it meant another day. The concept of keeping the fire alive was not metaphorical. It was literal, sacred, and vital. The continuity of fire also hints at a deeper social glue. Maintaining flame required cooperation, a shared understanding of responsibility. If one person failed, all suffered. In this way, fire reinforced not just survival, but social cohesion. It was the centre of the first human circles, the literal hearth of community. When we trace this lineage forward, it's astonishing to realise that by the time our own species, Homo sapiens, emerged roughly 300,000 years ago, the flame was already ancient. They were born into a world where fire was a given, not a miracle. The knowledge of how to make and tend it had become instinctual, an unbroken thread from ancestors who had walked the same earth for hundreds of millennia. From that point onward, no human species would ever again be without it. In the end, this period, the mid-Pleistocene, marks the dawn of cultural permanence. It's the first time in our history where a behaviour once learned became truly immortal. Fire use crossed the fragile gap between innovation and tradition, between survival strategy and identity. The species changed, the climate shifted, continents drifted, but the ember endured. We often imagine prehistory as a story of beginnings, the first tools, the first art, the first words. But this was a different kind of beginning, the beginning of continuity. Fire became a bridge across deep time, linking generations that would never meet, species that would never know each other. It outlasted ice and drought, hunger and extinction. It was, and remains, the oldest inheritance we share. Somewhere in the layered sediments of a cave in Africa or Europe lies a thin streak of black ash. It is what's left of a fire that burned 300,000 years ago, a brief warmth against a cold night, a light against a dark age. Yet in that line of ash, our entire species is foreshadowed. Every hearth since, every candle, every city's glow descends from it. The flame that flickers in every human home is the same ancient ember that our ancestors once protected with their lives. The species that learned to keep fire never let it go. What if I told you that every fire ever lit, from the first stone hearth to the flame on your kitchen stove, traces back to one lineage that refused to let the dark win? Around 300,000 years ago, the world stood at a crossroads. The earth was restless, swinging between warm and frozen ages. Forests retreated, deserts spread, and the great savannas of Africa stretched dry under the sun. Amid these shifting landscapes, new humans began to appear. They were taller, quicker, sharper in both mind and hand, and they arrived not as strangers to the flame, but as its heirs. By this time, Homo erectus, the firekeeper of the ancient world, was nearing its twilight. For nearly 2 million years they had endured everything the planet could throw at them: drought, flood, predators, even the cold of Ice Age winters. They had walked farther and lasted longer than any species of human before or since. Yet their world was changing. Populations of a newer kind were emerging. In Africa, early Homo sapiens. In Europe, the stocky and resilient Neanderthals. And in Asia, other branches like the enigmatic Denisovans. These were not distant cousins anymore. They were contemporaries. For the first time, multiple human species shared the stage. And though their faces and tongues differed, they all carried one secret in common: the mastery of fire. This was no coincidence. Archaeological evidence shows that by around 300,000 years ago, fire use had become universal across every known population of archaic humans. From caves in Israel and Germany to the riverbanks of Africa's Rift Valley, traces of hearths, burned bones and charcoal remain. Fire was no longer a luxury or a discovery. It was part of the human condition. It was knowledge as vital as breath. No species could have spread across such latitudes without it. The lineage of Homo erectus had not only survived, it had taught. We will never know whether the last populations of erectus met these rising humans face to face, but the timing makes it possible. In Southeast Asia, on the island of Java, erectus fossils persist well into this period, perhaps as late as 200,000 years ago. Meanwhile, on the African continent, early Homo sapiens were already shaping new tools and living in increasingly complex social groups. Somewhere, in a tropical valley or along a forest's edge, the torch may have quite literally been passed. Perhaps a wandering band of late erectus shared a spark from their fire with newcomers, an act neither symbolic nor intentional, but one that changed everything. Even without a meeting, the continuity is unmistakable. Every evidence of early sapiens and Neanderthals shows a life structured around fire. They built contained hearths lined with stones, burned animal bones for fuel, and used charcoal to extend the life of their flames. They were no longer guarding a miracle, but wielding a tool. What began as a fragile partnership between early humans and lightning's gift had become a stable relationship. Fire had moved from wonder to expectation. And yet, this transition marks something more profound than practical survival. Fire became inheritance, not of genetics, but of culture. It represented the first human technology that outlived its inventors. When one group vanished, another carried it forward. It was not reinvented with every generation. It was remembered. A lineage of light connecting the ancient past to the new world rising. In a sense, the story of Homo erectus did not end. It burned on in every species that followed. The fire that had once illuminated their caves now flickered in Neanderthal shelters and African savannas alike. It shaped not only how these new humans lived, but how they thought. With fire came new forms of cooperation and planning, new forms of trust. Its glow pulled people inward, giving shape to evenings of shared focus and mutual dependence. It is tempting to think of this as technology passing from one species to the next, but it was more intimate than that. Fire was knowledge encoded in daily rhythm. It didn't require instruction manuals or language, it required example. Children who grew up beside a fire learned its logic without words, how to feed it, how to respect it, how to fear it just enough. In this way, fire became the first teacher of continuity. The lesson: some things must never be forgotten. By this time, Homo erectus populations had likely thinned to isolated enclaves in Asia, small, scattered, and far from their continental origins. Yet, even as their numbers dwindled, their influence radiated across generations. Every early human species of this period shows evidence of behaviours inherited from their forerunners: refined tool-making, hunting cooperation, and above all the disciplined use of flame. It's as though the world's new humans were building atop a foundation already laid in stone and ash. Fire had also begun to change what humans could imagine. It lengthened the day, creating time that didn't exist before. In its glow, hands worked more precisely, minds wandered more freely. Stone tools became more symmetrical, hints of colour, use and ornament began to appear, and coordination within groups grew tighter. The firelight gave rise to reflection, literally and figuratively. When they looked into its flames, they saw themselves illuminated, moving shadows against the dark. Consciousness, once shaped by fear, now grew in the light of safety. There's a poetic symmetry to this moment in time. Just as one lineage faded, others ignited. Fire connected them across that divide. It wasn't evolution by replacement, but by relay. The baton was flame. The species that had once watched lightning strike the savannah now gave way to descendants who could spark fire when needed. What had begun as awe became mastery. We cannot yet prove whether Homo erectus directly mingled with these newcomers. No DNA has survived to confirm it, though some genetic models suggest that tiny echoes of their genome may live on in us, folded deep within the complex history of interbreeding that shaped later humans. But their cultural fingerprint is undeniable. The same fire that warmed their nights and cooked their meat became the foundation upon which all later civilizations were built. By the close of this era, around 200,000 years ago, the torch had passed fully into new hands. The Earth's stage now belonged to humans who would one day call themselves sapiens. But their fire was not new. It was ancient light, burning through the generations. Every flame since then, from the first hearths of Africa to the torches of the Roman Empire, the oil lamps of ancient Mesopotamia, the sparks inside modern engines, is, in an unbroken line, that same fire. It's easy to overlook how improbable that continuity is. Fire doesn't fossilize. It leaves only traces: ash, char, soot, and memory. And yet, across continents and epochs, it was never lost again. The chain of transmission from those first embers has lasted longer than any dynasty, any species, any empire. That unbroken continuity is perhaps humanity's greatest achievement. Not invention, but preservation. We often celebrate progress, but survival through knowledge is a quieter triumph. The humans of 300,000 years ago did not just inherit fire, they inherited responsibility. To keep it alive, to teach it, to share it. Their success ensured that no human species would ever again face the dark unarmed. In the end, Homo erectus may have disappeared from the earth, but their legacy did not fade. It burned in every campfire that followed, every meal cooked, every hand warmed. They didn't vanish into extinction. They became the invisible ancestor behind every flicker of light. They did not know they were passing history forward, but they did, one ember at a time. Imagine the end of a species not as a sudden collapse, but as a long, quiet evening. The sun setting over a river, the smell of damp earth after rain, a few small fires flickering under a tropical sky that no longer remembers their name. This was the twilight of Homo erectus, a species that had seen everything, from the birth of fire to the reshaping of continents, and yet ended not with extinction in a single moment, but with silence. By roughly 150,000 years ago, Homo erectus had disappeared from almost everywhere it once thrived. Their trails had faded from the Rift Valley. Their tools no longer littered the caves of the Caucasus or the plains of China. Other humans now roamed those lands, broader-skulled, sharper-minded, newly arrived. But far to the southeast, beyond the mainland's edge, on the island of Java, a few groups remained. They had survived everything the planet had thrown at them for nearly 2 million years. Volcanic winters, changing climates, predators, competition. The world had changed again and again, and they had adapted every time. But now, on that humid island, surrounded by thick forests and steaming rivers, their story was nearing its last paragraph. The site of Ngandong, along the Solo River in Java, holds what may be the final chapter of their fossil record. Here, archaeologists found skull caps and long bones weathered smooth by the flow of water and time. Dating them has taken decades of effort and debate, but the consensus now points to an age between roughly 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. If those dates hold, it means that Homo erectus outlived its cousins elsewhere by tens of thousands of years, persisting into a time when early Homo sapiens already walked the earth. In these river valleys and floodplains, amid monsoon rains and fertile soil, the last firekeepers endured. We can imagine their world, lush and alive, yet dangerous. Thick forests pressed close to the riverbanks, filled with elephants, crocodiles, and birds that fill the dawn with echoing calls. Herds of ancient bovines grazed in the clearings, and turtles basked on muddy banks. The same turtles whose cracked shells archaeologists still find near Homo erectus campsites. These were not helpless survivors. Even in their final generations, they hunted, butchered, and cooked, with the quiet confidence of beings who knew how to live. Their hands still shaped simple stone tools. Their fires still glowed at night. If intelligence is measured by endurance, they were among the most successful species in history. But survival is not the same as dominance. The world around them was changing in ways they could not see. Sea levels rose and fell with glacial pulses, cutting off migration routes and isolating populations. Volcanoes erupted across the Indonesian archipelago, spewing ash and reshaping the land. The great river valleys shifted course, burying old camps under layers of sediment, and all the while the climate oscillated between dry and wet extremes, shrinking their hunting ranges. Slowly, the once connected populations of Homo erectus became scattered into small, isolated groups. Some likely perished in floods or famine. Others may have wandered inland and vanished into forests too deep to leave traces. By the final 1,000 generations, only a few small bands remained, perhaps numbering in the hundreds. They would have known nothing of their isolation, nothing of their uniqueness. To them, the world was as it had always been, a cycle of foraging, hunting, resting, and moving with the seasons. The fires they built were the same as their ancestors had made for almost 2 million years. The rhythm of sparks and ashes, day and night, was their only history. At night their camps must have looked like tiny constellations mirrored on the ground, each hearth a point of warmth and memory surrounded by shadow. Around them, the forest seethed with sound, cicadas, frogs, the occasional roar of a leopard or the distant crack of thunder. But near the fire there was order, familiarity, safety. For a moment the night belonged to them. The same gestures that had once spread across continents, feeding flame, cracking bone, sharpening stone, continued here, on this small island, in a shrinking circle of life. The Ngandong fossils tell us something profound about these final humans. The skulls are heavy-browed and thick, the brains smaller than those of later species, but the faces show endurance, not failure. They were built for persistence. Even in decline, Homo erectus adapted to the world as it came. They were not outcompeted overnight, nor destroyed by catastrophe. They simply reached the end of their ecological thread. Too few, too scattered, too specialised for a changing Earth. Their world grew smaller until one morning, perhaps after a storm or a failed hunt, a fire went out and was not relit. We do not know what their final moments were like. There was no witness, no farewell. But we can infer this much. Their extinction was quiet. No great predator or flood erased them entirely. The end came softly, as the embers of their lineage cooled over centuries. They faded not because they were weak, but because time itself moved on. New humans were rising in other lands, species who would shape fire with purpose, language and art. But the knowledge those beings carried, the habit of gathering round flame, came from the same ancient source. In that sense, Homo erectus did not vanish. Their light lived on in every fire still burning. When you think about it, their survival on Java was an act of astonishing resilience. They had crossed oceans before humans could sail. They had survived volcanic winters and ice ages without the tools or words of their successors. They were the first to turn fear into light, the first to use fire to carve order into the wild. Their legacy is not in monuments or art, but in something older and more essential, the persistence of flame as memory. Every species after them, from Heidelbergensis to sapiens, inherited that ritual. It was never reinvented, only remembered. The last Homo erectus likely died without knowing they were the last. Perhaps an old individual lay near the ashes of a fire one night, the smoke curling upward as rain began to fall. Around them the forest exhaled, indifferent and eternal. The flame sputtered, then dimmed, then vanished into the wind. By dawn the hearth was cold, the stones wet, the camp abandoned. But the ember they once carried, the knowledge of light, had already travelled far beyond their island, carried in the minds and hands of new humans rising elsewhere. We often measure greatness by novelty, by invention, by change. But there is another kind of greatness, the greatness of endurance. For nearly 2 million years Homo erectus kept the light alive. They crossed deserts and deltas, adapted to forests and ice, endured everything the planet could devise. They were the proof that survival is an art. And though their story ended quietly on the banks of a forgotten river, their influence endures in every fire lit since. There are no monuments for them, no carved names, no songs, only ashes. But in those ashes lies the foundation of everything that followed. Every warm night by a fire, every hearth, every act of human reflection traces back to that moment when one of their ancestors first cupped their hands around a spark. The last hearths of Homo erectus cooled long ago, but their glow remains, in memory, in lineage, in every flicker that still keeps the dark at bay. Perhaps what made their ending so haunting was not its tragedy, but its completeness. Homo erectus had done what few species ever achieve. They had reached the natural limit of what their world could offer. Their tools, their movements, their understanding of the land, all were perfected within their simplicity. There was nothing left to invent, no pressure to evolve, no crisis that demanded change fast enough to rewrite their form. They had become masters of balance. For almost 2 million years they had lived within the boundaries of what the earth gave them, never exceeding it, never collapsing under it. Theirs was a long equilibrium, and all equilibria eventually end. When we study their fossils, we see not a primitive creature but a body perfectly attuned to motion and endurance. The long legs, the broad chest, the subtle curve of the skull, these were the signatures of a species that could walk endlessly, that could track a herd for days, that could cross mountain passes and flooded plains without complaint. In them, nature found a design that worked, and so it held steady for millennia. That stability itself might have been their undoing. For while they endured, other lineages began to experiment. Larger brains, more complex tools, more flexible behaviours. Homo erectus had already solved survival. The next challenge was imagination, and that belonged to others. It is tempting to think of them as fading quietly into genetic memory, but perhaps they persisted in subtler ways, their gestures, the way they sat by fire, the ways they learned from elders. These behaviours ripple forward through deep time. Every time we pass knowledge hand to hand rather than reinvent it, we echo that same continuity. On Java, a child may have learned how to shape a stone flake from a parent who had learned it from theirs, in a chain that stretched back unbroken for thousands of generations. The fire was never just fuel, it was a classroom. In that sense, their final centuries may have been filled not with decline, but with routine. Days spent foraging in the forests, tending embers, hunting turtles and deer. Nights filled with the sound of rain on palm leaves, the hiss of damp wood drying in the coals. The pace of their lives would have seemed timeless, each generation living almost exactly as the last. They did not need prophecy to sense that the world was shifting. They would have felt it in smaller details. Animals migrating differently, seasons turning harsher, rains coming late. Their adaptation was not to change, but to endure through it. And when they finally vanished, the earth itself kept no record but the subtle signatures of ash and bone. Yet even those traces tell a quiet truth. They were not erased by failure. They were absorbed into what came next. In their long passage through time, they had shaped landscapes, burned clearings, carved tools that influenced the hands of those who followed. In a geological instant, their kind disappeared. But in an evolutionary sense, their rhythm of life still beats beneath ours. Every fire we light, every story we tell beside it, carries a faint echo of their last hearth. It may be the most poetic legacy of all, that the ones who vanished in silence taught us how to keep the silence at bay. The last of Homo erectus did not just end an era, they closed the apprenticeship of humanity itself. What followed, the thinkers, the painters, the dreamers, inherited not only the flame, but the patience of those who kept it alive for almost 2 million years. And perhaps, on some forgotten night by the Solo River, the final fire burned a little longer than usual, as if time itself paused, just long enough for that light to pass hands once more, from the old world into the new. Imagine this. Every light you see tonight, from the faintest candle flicker to the glare of a city skyline, is a descendant of one forgotten flame. The glow that defines our modern world, from rocket engines to the soft blue light of your screen, is part of a single, unbroken inheritance that began with Homo erectus. Nearly 2 million years ago, a small being crouched beside a fire that was not yet fully theirs, perhaps a stolen ember from a lightning strike, and guarded it through the night. That moment, however ordinary it may have seemed, marked the beginning of something extraordinary. It was the first time life on Earth learned not just to survive the elements, but to keep one of them as its own. When we trace that story forward, what emerges is not simply the tale of a species, but of a principle, the human compulsion to preserve, to adapt, to carry light through darkness. Homo erectus was not the strongest nor the most intelligent by our later standards, but they were the most enduring. They lived for nearly 1.8 million years, a time span that makes our own species, at just over 300,000, seem like a brief experiment. They mastered the art of continuity. Their genius was not invention, but persistence. To live through so many ages of shifting climate, predators, droughts, and migrations required something deeper than intelligence. It required memory, cooperation, and patience. Every time Homo erectus passed a flame from one generation to the next, they passed more than warmth. They passed a template for civilization itself, the act of tending, of protecting something fragile because it makes tomorrow possible. Fire was their first teacher in time. It had to be fed, it had to be watched, it had to be shared. It introduced the first rhythms of planning and care, the first awareness that the future could be shaped. In keeping fire alive, they began keeping meaning alive, and so the ember spread. It crossed continents and ages, transforming from torch to hearth, from forge to engine. Each iteration was a reflection of the same ancient gesture, to take the raw forces of the world and turn them into tools of belonging. The lineage of that gesture is everywhere around us. When a scientist adjusts the temperature of a plasma reactor, when a child blows out birthday candles, when a satellite re-enters the atmosphere trailing a line of flame, they are all unknowingly performing the same ancient ritual. The ritual of Homo erectus. To think of them only as primitive is to misunderstand what endurance really means. They outlasted empires before empires existed. They crossed more miles of Earth than any human species before or since. Their bones rest under layers of volcanic ash and river mud, but their presence still burns quietly beneath our skin. Every act of warmth, every flicker of curiosity, every instinct pushed beyond the horizon echoes their first decisions. They taught us, without knowing, that curiosity is survival, that to step beyond what is known is to stay alive. Their story also humbles us. We, with our satellites and our nuclear fires, have existed for a fraction of their time. Yet our arrogance often blinds us to the fragility of that continuity. Homo erectus did not rule the planet. They adapted to it. They did not reshape the world in their image. They endured within its limits. Their fire was never destructive. It was small, shared, and sacred. In an age defined by excess, remembering that balance may be the truest way to honour them. The archaeological record tells us what they left: bones, tools, ash. But what they gave us is harder to measure. The first sense of home, the first confidence in the night, the first moment when danger became beauty. When they gathered around their fires, the darkness no longer belonged to predators alone. It became a place of stories, of rest, of thought. Fire turned the endless savannah into something human. That transformation, from fear to familiarity, is the very heart of civilization. We may never know their names, their words, or their dreams, but we live in the light they began. The same impulse that drove them to tend their embers now drives us to keep our cities lit through every night, to explore space with burning engines, to study the very stars that once watched over their camps. Fire, in all its forms, remains the mirror of what we are, fragile, radiant, and restless. Perhaps, in some quiet way, we still carry their awe. The moment when one of them first cupped hands around a glowing coal, feeling both fear and wonder, was the birth of something more than species. It was the birth of responsibility. To keep something alive not because it is easy, but because without it, the world goes dark. And so, from that first ember in the African night to the neon glow of our modern age, the story has never truly changed. We are still the keepers of fire, not only of flame, but of knowledge, connection, and continuity. Every light we create is an act of remembrance. Every campfire, candle, and circuit traces its lineage back to the same trembling hands that learned to hold heat without being consumed by it. Our ancestors' fires have long since turned to dust, but their light has never gone out. It glows in every home. every street, every spark of thought. It lives in us, the descendants of the first species who dared to touch the sun and call it their own. Perhaps what made that first circle of fire so extraordinary was not only what it gave, warmth, light, and cooked food, but what it revealed, a new kind of attention. Before, every task in daylight had been a reaction to the outside world. Chase, flee, gather, survive. But around the fire something changed. The danger retreated just far enough for awareness to turn inward. For the first time, a mind could linger on memory, could observe not only what is, but what was. A pause entered human time. It was the beginning of reflection itself, the slow birth of story, of planning, of the strange ability to imagine tomorrow before it arrived. At sites like Gesher Benot Ya'aqov, it is easy to focus on the physical evidence, the clustered stones, the ash lenses, the burnt fish bones that speak of routine. But what they truly represent is rhythm, the start of social continuity. Someone learned how to maintain the fire, another learned where to place the fuel, others brought food to share. The campfire, for the first time in natural history, became a structure without walls, a home made entirely of cooperation. It was an invention of social architecture before there were any buildings at all. As evening fell, the fire did something else to the human body. It changed the way we saw each other. Faces once only recognised in fleeting daylight were now seen again in the orange pulse of flame. Expression mattered. Gaze met gaze. Eyes reflected light back and forth like mirrors. That may have strengthened not just bonds, but empathy itself. Firelight was both illumination and rehearsal, the first stage lighting for emotion. Some anthropologists suggest this could have shaped our ability to read feelings, to tell friend from rival, to anticipate intent. In other words, fire didn't just warm the body, it began to warm the mind. And then there was sound. Flames crackled, wood sighed, wind moaned through branches, and somewhere in that shifting chorus came the first murmurs of language. Not words as we know them, but small rhythmic sounds. Laughter, mimicry, reassurance. Night around a campfire encouraged voice because for once voice could be heard. The fire held back the noise of predators and gave a safe bubble for communication to evolve. The human voice was, in a way, born of the same phenomenon that gave us cooked meat, a product of the quiet after the hunt. When the flames died down, the embers glowed like a heartbeat, marking the passage of time in slow rhythm. The group would sleep closer, more peacefully, perhaps dreaming longer, deeper dreams than ever before. And from those dreams, imagination grew, the kind that could connect the hiss of fire with the shimmer of stars above, seeing patterns between earth and sky. That spark of connection, linking warmth to meaning, is still with us. Every bedtime story, every campfire song, every shared silence beneath flickering light is the faint continuation of that first ancient circle. Fire, more than any invention, turned isolation into belonging. It was not just a tool, it was the world's first conversation. Imagine this. Every spark, from the smallest candle flame to the burning cores of rockets that pierce our sky, is part of one continuous story. A story that began not in cities or temples, but in the trembling hands of a creature that stood upright in the dark and decided not to be afraid of it anymore. Long before language, before gods, before the idea of home, there was the glow of fire. The first frontier between chaos and control. To tame it was to change not only the world, but the shape of what could exist within it. That is what we inherited. Not the flame itself, but the will to keep it alive. When Homo erectus learned to tend fire, the universe tilted slightly toward a consciousness. For the first time, life on Earth shaped its environment instead of surrendering to it. The fire's warmth expanded our range, pushing us out of Africa into the chill of Eurasia. Its light stretched our waking hours, allowing thought to wander after sunset. Its heat softened food, its glow softened fear. From this fragile trinity, nourishment, safety and wonder, everything else began. The hearth was not an invention. It was a mirror, one that reflected back the first faint outlines of what would become humanity. Through the smoke of that ancient fire, something unseen passed forward. Memory. Generations learned to guard coals, to feed them, to carry them. The flame became a living thread that tied the past to the present, the teacher to the apprentice, the elder to the child. To keep it burning was to belong to a lineage that reached backward through time. Every ember that survived the night represented a victory against extinction, proof that intelligence was no longer just about instinct, but about care. The same hands that once shaped stone now shaped continuity. That continuity grew restless. Fire demanded movement. With it came the courage to cross rivers, to climb into colder latitudes, to challenge the boundaries that had once confined us. It became a passport across continents and an equalizer among predators. The world's first technology turned humans into a geological force. Wherever our ancestors went, fire followed, clearing forests, forging tools, hardening clay. Entire ecosystems reshaped themselves in its wake. In that moment, Earth had met its first self-aware element. Even now, every major transformation in human history can be traced back to that one decision: to hold the flame instead of fleeing from it. Agriculture, metallurgy, cities, engines, electricity, all are variations of that same principle, the conversion of energy into meaning. We learned not just to burn wood, but to burn time, imagination, and memory itself. Fire became thought made visible. In every flickering light bulb, every furnace, every launchpad ignition, you can still glimpse the reflection of that first campfire, burning in the eyes of a different kind of ape. It is humbling to think how brief our own species has been compared to theirs. Homo erectus thrived for nearly 2 million years, longer than all recorded human civilization by a factor of hundreds. They were not a prelude to us. They were the main act of existence for almost 2 million centuries. Theirs was not an age of progress, but of mastery. They found balance within limits, and in that balance they outlasted every catastrophe the planet threw their way. The secret of their success was not invention, but continuity, an art we have almost forgotten. If there is a lesson buried in their ashes, it may be this: fire was never meant to conquer, only to sustain. The flame they tended was small, fragile, tended by hands that knew cold and hunger intimately. Yet that fragility was the source of their wisdom. It taught patience, restraint, vigilance. To keep fire alive without letting it consume the camp was to learn stewardship, the first form of responsibility. In every sense that matters, we did not just inherit their technology, we inherited their moral experiment, and we are still taking that test. The fires we light today burn across continents, in engines, in reactors, in data centers, in wars. We have multiplied the ember 1 billion-fold, yet the lesson remains the same. A flame without humility devours what it was meant to sustain. We carry within us the same dual legacy: to create or to destroy, to illuminate or to scorch. In our city's glow, it is easy to forget that every light is borrowed, not owned. We are still the same firekeepers, still guarding warmth against the cold vastness outside, still learning when to let the coals rest. If Homo erectus could see the Earth now, glittering from orbit like a constellation of captive suns, they might not recognize its scale, but they would understand its meaning. Every streetlight, every rocket flare, every household lamp is a continuation of their instinct to make the night less terrifying. From their first sparks in an African cave to the glowing veins of modern civilization seen from space, the story is one seamless line of light stretching across epochs. Theirs was the dawn of the firekeepers, ours is the age of their descendants. We light our worlds in their memory, though we rarely know it. What began as a whisper of flame beneath an ancient sky became the anthem of our species, a promise to keep something burning, to never again surrender to the dark. And perhaps, when the last of our own lights fade, what will remain is not the smoke of our machines, but the quiet echo of their first fire, still glowing somewhere in the long imagination of the earth itself. Perhaps the greatest revolution that fire brought was not in what it cooked or warmed, but in what it slowed. In a world of constant danger and movement, the fire demanded stillness. Someone had to stay and tend it, to watch, to guard, to feed the coals through the night. That act of waiting, of attention without immediate reward, may have been one of the first exercises in patience. Fire transformed time itself, where before every hour was survival, now there were pauses, intervals of observation and imagination. Around the hearth, time stretched, and in that stretching, the human mind began to take shape. In this new rhythm of life, community became more than proximity. The firelight drew the group inward, its glow defining a small circle of safety against the unknown. Within that boundary, gestures softened, cooperation deepened. Parents could watch their young, the injured could rest longer. The faintest beginnings of culture, shared habits, preferences, unspoken roles, took root beside those flames. Fire was not merely a technology, it was a social contract. To maintain it was to maintain one another. And so, the small miracle of heat and light became the centre of everything human that would follow. Teaching, sharing, protecting, belonging. The world beyond the light's reach remained vast and unknowable. Shadows moved in the brush, eyes gleamed from the dark, and strange sounds echoed through the night. Yet even that boundary, the contrast between firelight and darkness, may have trained perception in new ways. It taught early humans to attend to nuance, to see gradations of brightness and shadow, to interpret flickers as movement or intent. Perhaps that sensitivity, honed by firelight, became part of the neurological groundwork for imagination itself. When the flames danced, they projected fleeting shapes on rock walls, an accidental proto-cinema that might have inspired curiosity about pattern and meaning. Archaeologists sometimes speak of the architecture of the campfire, how its position shaped the space around it. Even without houses, fire created rooms, a centre, a perimeter, a boundary between the known and the wild. People gathered close to its core not just for warmth, but for orientation. It became the axis of social gravity, a forerunner of the village square and the temple altar. The ancient circle of stone surrounding it foreshadowed the first deliberate monuments humans would one day raise, always circular, always echoing the geometry of the fire pit. The auditory landscape of the night must have changed too. Where once the dark was filled with roars and rustling, the fire crackled softly, filling silence with a steady rhythm. The steady pop of sap, the hiss of damp wood, the flutter of ash. These sounds may have offered comfort, a kind of reassurance that life continued while the body rested. It's not difficult to imagine lullabies emerging from this new quiet, or ritual chants timed to the crackle of the coals. The fire became not only a source of light, but of rhythm, a heartbeat for the tribe. With warmth came a rare gift, time to heal. The heat soothed wounds, dried hides, hardened wood, preserved food. This expansion of control, from day to night, from body to tool, was the first form of medicine. Healing no longer depended solely on luck or climate. It became an intentional act. Around the fire, hands could craft and repair in the safety of evening. Slowly, a culture of care replaced pure endurance, and perhaps, as generations passed, fire began to take on meanings that went beyond utility. It must have seemed alive, feeding on fuel, breathing air, transforming matter into light. To tend it was to witness transformation itself. The flames devoured what was dead and made it radiant, fleeting, and beautiful. That quiet miracle may have been the first metaphor, the realization that destruction and creation were not opposites, but phases of the same cycle. Fire taught that life could continue even as things were consumed. By the time Homo erectus gathered by their hearths in the Levant, fire had become more than a discovery. It was an inheritance. Each evening's blaze connected the living with their ancestors, those who had learned to borrow the lightning and make it stay. The campfire was a memory device, burning both literally and symbolically. It preserved not only warmth, but continuity, a thread of flame linking countless generations who never met. In that sense, those gatherings were the first rehearsals of everything human life would later contain: art, ceremony, kinship, storytelling, grief, and gratitude. The fire didn't just feed bodies, it fed awareness. It gave shape to the night, and with it, shape to thought itself. When they stared into the flames, they were seeing more than heat and light. They were watching the beginning of what it means to be conscious. And so, each night when the last ember was buried in ash and the first light of dawn touched the horizon, those ancient humans awoke not just to another day of survival, but to something far greater. The slow realization that they could change the world one small flame at a time. Aim.